Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we tell the complete story of Broxigar the Red, the orc warrior whose sacrifice transcended time itself and made him the only mortal ever to wound a god. In the time before darkness consumed the orc homeworld, before the blood of demons corrupted an entire civilization, there existed a world called Draenor. It was a land of sweeping savannas and towering mountains, of spirit-touched winds and ancestors who walked alongside the living. The orcs who called this world home lived according to traditions that stretched back beyond memory, honoring the elements and the spirits that guided them. Among the great clans of Draenor, the Blackrock clan stood as one of the mightiest. They were warriors of exceptional skill, miners who drew the black stone from the earth, smiths who forged weapons that sang with the heat of volcanic fire. Their holdings encompassed the mountains that gave them their name, volcanic peaks where the fires of the deep earth provided fuel for their great forges. The Blackrock clan had earned their reputation through generations of proven excellence. Their armor was the strongest on Draenor, their blades the sharpest, their warriors among the most feared. When the Blackrock marched to war, other clans took notice. When a Blackrock warrior made a promise, that promise was kept. The clan's honor was beyond question, their traditions sacred, their place in orcish society secured by deeds rather than words. It was into this clan that Broxigar was born. He came into the world alongside a brother named Varok, though Broxigar was the elder of the two. Their birth was celebrated as all orcish births were celebrated, with feasting and ceremony, with blessings from the shamans and acknowledgement from the clan's warriors. 2 healthy sons, born at once, was considered a good omen, a sign that the ancestors smiled upon the family. Their father was an orc named Korok, a warrior of the Blackrock clan whose own deeds had earned him honor among his people. Korok had fought in the clan's campaigns, had shed blood for Blackrock causes, had proven himself time and again on the field of battle. He raised his sons to be warriors as he was, instilling in them the values of honor, courage, and loyalty that defined the Blackrock way. The 2 brothers would grow to become legends in their own right, though their paths would diverge in ways that neither could have imagined. Varok would become High Overlord of the Horde, a leader whose name would be known throughout Azeroth, and Broxigar would achieve something even more remarkable, though he would not live to see the full extent of his legacy. Broxigar and Varok also had a half-brother, sharing the same mother but born of a different father. This half-brother would eventually have a daughter named Thrall, who would carry Broxigar's legacy in ways that stretched beyond blood and bone into the realm of destiny itself. The bonds of family would prove more enduring than any of them could have guessed, connecting Broxigar to the future, even as his deeds connected him to the ancient past. Growing up in the Blackrock clan meant growing up with a weapon in hand. Broxigar learned the arts of war from the moment he could hold an axe, trained in the traditions that had made his clan formidable for generations. He sparred with other young orcs, learned to read the flow of battle, discovered within himself a talent for combat that went beyond mere skill into something approaching instinct. The training was rigorous, as befitting a clan whose warriors were expected to be the finest on all of Draenor. Young orcs rose before dawn, their muscles still aching from the previous day's exercises, and threw themselves into drills that tested every aspect of their physical and mental capabilities. They learned to fight with axes and swords, with fists and improvised weapons, with anything that could be turned to lethal purpose. They studied tactics and strategy, the art of reading terrain and anticipating enemy movements. They hardened their bodies through endless repetition, building the strength and endurance that would allow them to fight for hours without rest. Broxigar excelled at all of it. He had a natural gift for combat that his instructors recognized early, an ability to process the chaos of battle and respond with appropriate action faster than most orcs could think. His reflexes were exceptional, his strength remarkable even by the standards of his warrior clan, and his determination to succeed was absolute. He pushed himself harder than his instructors demanded, rising earlier and training later, always seeking to improve, always striving to be worthy of the name Blackrock. The older warriors watched him with approval. They saw in young Broxigar the makings of a champion, an orc whose deeds would bring honor to the clan for generations. They shared their knowledge with him, teaching him tricks and techniques that could not be learned through formal instruction alone, the accumulated wisdom of warriors who had survived countless battles. Broxigar absorbed everything, his mind as hungry for knowledge as his body was hungry for combat. Among his closest companions during these years was an orc named Garno. The two were practically brothers themselves, bound not by blood, but by the kinship that forms between warriors who train together, fight together, and share the dreams of glory that burn in every young orc's heart. They spoke of the battles they would fight, the honors they would win, the songs that would be sung of their deeds around the fires of their people. The orcish society of those days operated according to rhythms that had remained unchanged for countless generations. Twice a year, during the sacred kosh'harg festival, the clans would gather at the base of the sacred mountain Oshugun. Warlocks were forbidden from attending these gatherings. Instead, shamans communed with the spirits of ancestors, seeking guidance and wisdom. Disputes between clans were settled peacefully, for the kosh'harg was a time of unity rather than conflict. These festivals represented the best of what orcish society could be. Warriors who might face each other in battle during other seasons sat together and shared stories. Young orcs competed in tests of strength and skill. Elders passed down the wisdom of generations to those who would carry it forward. It was a tradition that Broxigar remembered fondly in later years, a reminder of what his people had been before everything changed. For the orcs were not always the bloodthirsty warriors that the peoples of Azeroth would come to know. They were not always the green-skinned monsters who poured through the dark portal, bringing death and destruction. Once, they had been a people of honor, of tradition, of connection to the spirits and the land. They had their conflicts, certainly, for they were warriors by nature, but they also had their wisdom, their ceremonies, their deep reverence for the ancestors who had come before. Broxigar was of the generation that remembered this time. He was old enough to have experienced the world before the corruption, to have participated in the kosh'harg gatherings, to have known what it meant to be an orc in the truest sense of the word. This memory would stay with him throughout all the trials that followed, a foundation of identity that could not be entirely erased by the darkness that was to come. The brothers Broxigar and Varok grew into formidable warriors, each developing their own style and reputation. Where Varok would become known for his devastating cleave attacks and his unwavering discipline, Broxigar earned recognition for his sheer ferocity in battle, for his willingness to throw himself into the thickest fighting, for the way he seemed to embrace combat with a passion that bordered on the transcendent. They trained together, fought together, bled together. They were brothers in every sense that mattered, bound by ties that went beyond the accident of their shared parentage. When one fell, the other was there to help him rise. When one faced overwhelming odds, the other charged in without hesitation. This bond would shape both their lives in ways that neither could have predicted. The relationship between Broxigar and Varok was marked by friendly competition as well as brotherly devotion. They pushed each other to be better, each trying to outdo the other in training exercises and proven grounds. When Varok mastered a new technique, Broxigar would work tirelessly until he could match it. When Broxigar achieved some feat of arms, Varok would not rest until he had equaled or surpassed it. This rivalry was never bitter, never divisive. It was the healthy competition of warriors who loved each other and wanted to see each other succeed. Their father Koruk watched his sons grow with pride that he rarely expressed in words, but showed in countless small ways. He ensured they had the best instructors, the finest weapons appropriate to their age, the opportunities to prove themselves in ways that would build their reputations. He had done his part in the glory of the Blackrock clan, and now his sons would continue that legacy. It was the way of orcish society, the passing of honor from generation to generation. The Blackrock clan's holdings were centered around the volcanic mountains that gave the clan its name. The forges there burned constantly, producing weapons and armor that were prized throughout all of Draenor. The smiths of the Blackrock were legendary for their skill, able to work metal in ways that other clans could not match. Warriors from other clans would sometimes travel great distances to acquire Blackrock forged weapons, offering trade goods and favors in exchange for the finest arms available. Broxigar learned some of this craft himself, though his talents lay more in using weapons than in making them. Every Blackrock warrior was expected to understand the tools of their trade, to know how a blade was forged and how that forging affected its performance in battle. This knowledge made them better fighters, able to assess enemy weapons at a glance and exploit any weaknesses in their construction. The years of Broxigar's youth passed in this way, filled with training and competition, with festivals and ceremonies, with the slow accumulation of skills that would one day make him a legend. He could not have known then what destiny had in store for him, could not have imagined the journeys he would take or the sacrifices he would make. He was simply a young orc warrior, dreaming of glory, preparing for a future that seemed bright with possibility. But the world they knew, however, was about to change in ways that would test every tradition, every bond, every principle that the orcs held dear. A shadow was falling across Draenor, a darkness that would corrupt their society from within and transform them into instruments of destruction that the cosmos had rarely seen. The corruption of the orcs did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process, a slow poisoning of the soul that began with the rise of the shaman Ner'zhul and continued under his apprentice Gul'dan. These orcish leaders had come into contact with forces beyond their world, entities of immense power who offered them strength in exchange for service. The Burning Legion, that vast demonic army that had scourged countless worlds across the great dark beyond, had turned its attention to Draenor. The demons saw in the orcs a potential weapon, a warrior race that could be corrupted and transformed into shock troops for their endless crusade of destruction. All they needed was a way in, a crack in the orcish soul through which their corruption could flow. They found their opening through the ambitions of Ner'zhul and Gul'dan. These orcs were promised power beyond imagining, and in their hunger for that power, they opened the door to something that would consume their entire civilization. The demons manipulated them, twisted their perceptions, convinced them that the Draenei who shared their world were enemies who needed to be destroyed. The war against the Draenei was the first step in the corruption of the orcish race. Orcs, who had once been honorable warriors, became participants in genocide, slaughtering the peaceful people who had lived alongside them for generations. The blood they spilled began to change them, began to awaken something darker within their spirits. And then came the blood of Mannoroth. The Pit Lord Mannoroth, one of the most powerful demons in the Burning Legion's armies, offered his blood to the orcs. Those who drank it gained strength and ferocity beyond anything they had known before, but the price was their souls. The blood bound them to the Legion, made them slaves to demonic will, corrupted them in ways that went far deeper than the physical changes that turned their skin green. The ceremony of blood drinking was presented to the orcs as a gift, a source of power that would make them unstoppable in battle. Gul'dan and his warlocks had been preparing the clans for this moment, stoking their rage against the Draenei, feeding their hunger for conquest. When Mannoroth's blood was offered, the orcs drank eagerly, not understanding the chains they were placing upon their own souls. The effect was immediate and devastating. The orcs felt power flood through their veins, strength beyond anything they had ever known. Their muscles swelled, their senses sharpened, their capacity for violence expanded until it consumed all other considerations. They became living weapons, forged for destruction, their capacity for mercy and restraint burned away by the fell fire that now flowed in their blood. Broxigar, like so many of his people, was caught up in this corruption. The exact circumstances of how each individual orc fell to the demon blood varied, but the result was the same. For Broxigar, the blood seemed to amplify everything that made him a warrior. His natural talent for combat became something approaching supernatural ability. His ferocity, which had always been notable, became almost uncontrollable. The joy he had once found in the clean competition of the training grounds was replaced by a hunger for actual violence, for the feeling of axe meeting flesh, for the screams of dying enemies. The Broxigar who had honored the traditions of the kosh'harg, who had revered the spirits and respected his ancestors, was buried beneath layers of bloodlust and demonic influence. He was still there, somewhere deep inside, but he had no power to act, no ability to resist the urges that the demon blood imposed. He was a passenger in his own body, watching as his hands committed atrocities that the orc he had been would never have contemplated. An entire civilization was transformed, their honor replaced by bloodlust, their traditions corrupted into brutal mockeries, their connection to the spirits severed and replaced by fell magic. The shamans who had communed with the elements found those connections broken, replaced by the teachings of warlocks who drew power from demonic sources. The ceremonies that had united the clans in peace became rallies that united them in war. Everything that orcs had been was twisted into a parody of itself, a corruption that served only the goals of the Burning Legion. The formation of the Horde under Blackhand represented the culmination of this corruption. The various clans were united not by the peaceful traditions of the kosh'harg, but by the chains of demonic servitude. They were no longer individual tribes with their own customs and identities. They were a war machine designed for one purpose and one purpose only: destruction. Blackhand himself was a puppet, his authority propped up by Gul'dan's shadow council of warlocks. The true power behind the Horde was demonic. The true purpose was to serve the Burning Legion's agenda. The orcs believed they were fighting for glory, for conquest, for the expansion of their people. They did not understand that they were simply tools, expendable weapons in a cosmic war that had raged for millennia. Broxigar served in this horde without questioning its purpose. The demon blood that flowed in his veins made questioning impossible. He followed orders. He killed when directed to kill. He fought in campaigns whose goals he barely understood. The warrior who had once dreamed of honorable combat at the kosh'harg was gone, replaced by a berserker who knew only the joy of slaughter. The construction of the dark portal opened the way to a new world, a world called Azeroth that the demons had targeted for conquest. The portal was a feat of dark magic, combining the powers of orcish warlocks and the Eridar sorcerers who served the Legion. It tore a hole between dimensions, creating a pathway that would allow armies to march from one world to another. The orcs poured through this gateway, emerging in the black morass of the eastern kingdoms, and they brought war with them. War on a scale that Azeroth had not seen since the ancient times when the Burning Legion first attempted to invade. The peaceful inhabitants of this new world had no idea what was coming for them, no concept of the destruction that was about to be unleashed. The First War, as it would come to be called, was a catastrophe for the human kingdom of Stormwind. The corrupted orcs swept across the land with a ferocity that the humans could not match. Cities burned, populations fled or were slaughtered, and the great kingdom that had stood for generations crumbled before the green tide. The humans had never seen anything like the Horde. They were accustomed to fighting other humans or occasionally dealing with the various monsters and beasts that inhabited their lands. But the orcs were something else entirely, a civilization of warriors, each one stronger than most human soldiers, driven by bloodlust that knew no bounds, organized into a military force that moved with terrifying efficiency. Town after town fell to the orcish advance. The humans tried to mount defenses, but they were overwhelmed at almost every turn. The orcs did not take prisoners in any meaningful sense. They did not negotiate. They did not pause to consolidate their gains before pressing forward. They were a wave of destruction that rolled across the land, leaving nothing but corpses and ashes in their wake. Broxigar fought in this war, as did his brother Varok. They were warriors of the Blackrock clan, and their clan was at the forefront of the Horde's campaigns. The blood that stained their axes was human blood. The screams that filled their ears were human screams, and the fires that lit the sky were the burning remnants of human civilization. The Blackrock clan had a particular reputation even among the Horde. They were considered the most disciplined, the most effective, the most deadly of all the orcish clans. Their leader, Blackhand, held the position of war chief, and their warriors were the elite troops that were deployed when victory was essential. Broxigar and Varok served in this capacity, shock troops who were sent to break the toughest resistance. Broxigar lost count of the battles he fought during the First War. They blurred together into a continuous stream of violence, the clash of weapons, the spray of blood, the screams of the dying, the crash of buildings collapsing, the roar of flames consuming everything in their path. Each victory led to another advance, another town to conquer, another population to destroy. There was no end to it, only the endless hunger for more. It is difficult to know what Broxigar thought during this time, whether the corruption had completely consumed his sense of honor, or whether some part of him remembered what his people had been before. The demon blood was a powerful thing, capable of drowning out doubt and conscience beneath waves of battle rage. Many orcs would later describe those years as a kind of nightmare, a time when they were passengers in their own bodies, watching themselves commit atrocities without the ability to stop. For Broxigar, there were moments when something like awareness would break through. In the aftermath of a particularly brutal battle, when the bloodlust had temporarily faded, he would look at what he had done and feel something that might have been horror. But the demon blood would rise again, flooding his system with renewed rage, and the moment of clarity would vanish beneath the red tide. These glimpses were fleeting and largely forgotten by the time the bloodlust faded permanently, but they left traces, small cracks in the wall that the corruption had built around his true self. Those cracks would become important later when the demon blood began to fade and the true Broxigar started to emerge from beneath the monster he had become. What is known is that Broxigar was an exceptional warrior, even among a race of warriors. His skill with the axe was legendary, his ferocity in battle was unmatched, and his reputation grew with each campaign. He was known as Broxigar the Red, some say because of the color of his armor, others because of the blood that perpetually stained him from the enemies he slew. The fall of Stormwind marked the end of the First War, but it was not the end of the conflict. The survivors of Stormwind fled north, warning the other human kingdoms of the threat that was coming. This led to the formation of the Alliance of Lordaeron, a coalition of human kingdoms, dwarves, and elves who banded together to face the orcish horde. The Second War was a larger conflict than the first, spanning the entire Eastern Kingdoms and involving races and nations that had previously stayed out of human affairs. The Horde pushed north from the ruins of Stormwind, and the Alliance gathered to meet them. It was a war that would determine the fate of the entire continent. The Alliance of Lordaeron brought together forces that the Horde had not anticipated. The human kingdoms, which had been divided and often in conflict with each other, united behind a common cause. The dwarves of Ironforge contributed to their legendary fighting skills and technological innovations. The high elves of Quel'Thalas, whose lands had been directly threatened by the Horde's advance, provided their formidable magical capabilities. Even the gnomes contributed their engineering expertise to the war effort. Broxigar continued to serve as a warrior of the Blackrock clan throughout these campaigns. He fought in battles whose names would echo through history witnessed devastation on a scale that few mortals had ever seen, and killed more enemies than he could ever count. The corruption still held him, still drove him forward with an insatiable hunger for battle. The battles of the Second War ranged across the breadth of the eastern kingdoms, from the verdant hills of Hillsbrad to the snowy peaks of Alterac, from the forests of Quel'Thalas to the shores of Lordimir Lake. The conflict touched almost every corner of the continent. Fortresses were besieged and taken, fleets clashed on the open sea, and armies met on fields that would be remembered for generations. Broxigar fought in many of these engagements. His axe claimed Alliance lives at the siege of Lordaeron, at the battle for Hillsbrad, at the assault on Quel'Thalas. He was there when the Horde's naval forces clashed with the Alliance fleet, there when the trolls of the Amani joined the Horde's cause, there when the Death Knights first took to the field wielding their terrible powers. The Second War saw the Horde at the height of its power, and then saw that power shattered. The Alliance proved more formidable than the demons' plans had anticipated. The coordination between humans, dwarves, and elves created a military force capable of matching the orcish warriors. And crucially, the Horde's leadership fractured under the weight of internal conflicts and demonic manipulation. Gul'dan's betrayal was the fatal blow. The warlock, seeking power for himself, abandoned the Horde at a crucial moment to pursue his own interests. He took a significant portion of the Horde's forces with him on a suicidal quest for the tomb of Sargeras, weakening the main force at the worst possible time. This treachery, combined with the death of War Chief Orgrim Doomhammer's key lieutenants, threw the Horde into disarray. The turning point came when the Alliance pushed the Horde back, driving them toward the dark portal that had brought them to this world. The final battles were brutal affairs, desperate struggles, as the orcs fought to maintain their foothold on Azeroth. Broxigar was there for these last stands, fighting with the same ferocity that had characterized his entire career, but even his skills could not turn the tide. But in the end, the Alliance proved victorious. The dark portal was destroyed, the Horde was shattered, and the surviving orcs were rounded up and placed in internment camps. The great war machine that had terrorized Azeroth for years was broken, its warriors reduced to prisoners, its dream of conquest ended in defeat and captivity. These camps represented a new kind of hell for the orcish race. Stripped of their weapons, their freedom, and their purpose, the orcs fell into a lethargy that many attributed to some kind of racial depression. But the truth was more complicated. The demon blood was fading from their systems, and as it faded, the connection to the burning legion that had driven their ferocity was severed. The internment camps were scattered across the eastern kingdoms, hastily constructed compounds where the defeated orcs were held under guard. The conditions varied from camp to camp, but none of them were pleasant. The orcs were crowded into inadequate shelters, fed enough to survive but never enough to thrive, watched constantly by guards who remembered the horrors that these green-skinned monsters had inflicted upon their people. For the first time in years, orcs like Broxigar could think clearly. They could remember who they had been before the corruption, could recognize what they had become under its influence. For many, this clarity brought nothing but despair. They had committed atrocities beyond counting, had destroyed civilizations, had murdered innocents by the thousands. The weight of these memories was almost too much to bear. The lethargy that settled over the orcish race was as much spiritual as physical. Without the demon blood driving them, without the rage that had sustained them through years of warfare, the orcs had nothing left. They sat in their camps, staring at walls or at the sky, eating when food was provided, sleeping when exhaustion overcame them, but otherwise doing little. They were hollow shells, the fire that had burned within them extinguished. Some orcs simply died. Unable to bear the weight of their memories, unwilling to face an existence without purpose, they gave up. They stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped responding to any stimulus. They lay down and let themselves fade away, their spirits departing for whatever realm awaited them beyond life. Broxigar survived the internment camps, as did his brother Varok. They were among the orcs who endured the lethargy, who lived through years of captivity in the human compounds. Broxigar's survival was not due to any particular will to live, not at this point. It was simply the stubborn refusal of his body to give up, the same physical toughness that had carried him through countless battles, refusing to surrender even when his spirit had lost all hope. During this time, they had nothing to do but remember, to reflect on what they had done and what they had lost. Broxigar spent long hours sitting in silence, his mind replaying the events of the wars, cataloging the faces of those he had killed, trying to understand how the young warrior who had dreamed of honorable combat at the kosh'harg festivals had become a monster who murdered the innocent. He remembered specific moments with terrible clarity. A human woman clutching her child as his axe fell. A village elder who had tried to negotiate surrender, cut down before he could finish speaking. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, who had stood his ground despite his obvious terror and been rewarded with death. These memories, and thousands like them, haunted Broxigar's days and invaded his dreams. The guilt was crushing. Broxigar had been raised in a culture that valued honor above almost everything else, and he knew that what he had done had no honor in it. The demon blood had driven him, yes, but that was an explanation, not an excuse. He had killed, had slaughtered, had participated in genocide. These were his actions, his hands that had held the axe, his choices that had led him to this place. The liberation of the orcs came through an unlikely source. A young orc named Thrall, raised as a slave by humans, but eventually freed to discover his heritage, began freeing his people from the camps. His story was remarkable in its own right, a tale of survival and self-discovery that would have been legendary even without what came after. Thrall had been found as an infant in the aftermath of a battle, had been raised by a human lord named Aedelas Blackmore, who saw in him a potential weapon. He had been trained as a gladiator, taught to fight for the entertainment of humans, kept ignorant of his own people and their culture. But he had escaped, had found the shamans who could teach him the old ways, had discovered that the orcs were more than the mindless beasts that his captor had claimed. He sought to rebuild orcish society according to the old traditions, to reconnect with the spirits and the ancestors that the corruption had separated them from. It was an ambitious goal, perhaps an impossible one. The corruption had run deep, had touched every aspect of orcish life, had severed connections that had been maintained for generations beyond counting. But Thrall was determined to try. Thrall's vision offered hope to orcs who had believed themselves beyond redemption. He spoke of honor, of tradition, of a horde that would be different from the one that had devastated Azeroth. He did not deny what the orcs had done, did not try to excuse or minimize the atrocities they had committed. But he argued that the past did not have to define the future, that the orcs could choose to be better, that redemption was possible for those who truly sought it. He reached out to shamans like Drekthar, who had maintained their connection to the spirits even during the darkest times. Drekthar had been one of the few who had refused the demon blood, who had kept the old ways alive even when all around him were corrupted. He became Thrall's teacher, guiding him in the path of shamanism, helping him to reconnect with the spirits that the corruption had alienated. Together, they began the work of restoring what had been lost. The spirits were wary at first, reluctant to trust the orcs who had abandoned them for demonic power. But they recognized the sincerity of Thrall's intentions, saw that he truly sought to make amends, and gradually began to respond to the shaman's calls once more. Broxigar joined this new horde, as did Varok. They were veterans of all the wars, warriors whose skills had been proven countless times in battle. They had seen the worst that the corruption could do, had participated in atrocities that they would never forget, had carried the weight of those memories through years of captivity. But they were also orcs who remembered what their people had been before the corruption, who recognized in Thrall's vision an echo of the traditions they had honored in their youth. They remembered the kosh'harg festivals, the ceremonies of honor, the bond between warrior and spirit. They saw in Thrall's horde a chance to reclaim something that had been lost, to rebuild what the corruption had destroyed. They threw their support behind the young war chief, lending their experience and their axes to his cause. Their presence legitimized Thrall's leadership in the eyes of older orcs who might have questioned whether one so young could truly guide their people. If veterans like Broxigar and Varok believed in Thrall's vision, then perhaps there was something to it after all. The Third War came upon Azeroth like a storm that had been brewing for millennia. The Burning Legion, that vast demonic army that had corrupted the orcs and used them as pawns, was returning to finish what it had started. This time, there would be no subtle manipulations, no slow corruptions. The demons were coming in full force, and they intended to consume the world entirely. For Broxigar, the return of the Legion represented something more than just another war. These were the same demons who had corrupted his people, who had twisted the orcs into instruments of destruction, who had been responsible for all the atrocities that haunted his memories. Fighting them was not just a matter of survival, but of vengeance, of striking back against the forces that had taken everything from him. The undead scourge was the Legion's advance force, spreading plague and death across the northern kingdoms. The kingdom of Lordaeron fell to this tide of undeath, its Prince Arthas corrupted and transformed into a Death Knight who slaughtered his own father and led the Scourge's armies. The eastern kingdoms descended into chaos as the dead rose to consume the living. The speed of the Scourge's advance was terrifying. Cities that had stood for centuries fell within days. Armies that had been considered unbeatable were swept aside like leaves before a hurricane. The living had no defense against enemies who did not fear death, who felt no pain, who served a will that transcended individual survival. Thrall, guided by the mysterious prophet, led his people across the sea to Kalimdor. The prophet was Medivh, the same mage whose corruption had originally allowed the orcs to invade Azeroth, now seeking to make amends for his past sins. He had received visions warning him of the coming destruction, urging him to unite with other races against the demonic threat. It was a difficult journey, fraught with danger and uncertainty. The orcs had to flee the eastern kingdoms, had to leave behind the lands they had fought so hard to claim, had to venture across an ocean to a continent that none of them had ever seen. Many questioned Thrall's decision, wondered if they were fleeing from one danger only to find another. But the orcs made it to the new continent and began establishing themselves in the harsh lands that would become Durotar. The land was unforgiving, a desert of red rock and sparse vegetation, but it was free of the corruption that tainted everything back east. Here, the orcs could build something new, could create a society based on the old traditions, rather than the demonic influence that had destroyed them. But the Legion was not content to simply destroy the eastern kingdoms. They followed the mortal races to Kalimdor, intent on claiming the World Tree Nordrassil and using its power to achieve their ultimate goal. The World Tree was more than just a tree. It was a source of immense magical power, planted by the demigods in ages past, connected to the very fabric of the world. If the Legion could corrupt it, could drain its power, they would have the energy needed to bring Sargeras fully into Azeroth. The demons poured through portals, their numbers seemingly endless, and the combined forces of the Horde, the Alliance, and the Night Elves gathered to stop them. It was an unprecedented alliance, bringing together races that had been at war with each other for generations. Humans fought alongside orcs. Night Elves coordinated with the forces that had once been their enemies. The threat they faced was too great for old grudges to matter. The defense of Mount Hyjal, where the World Tree stood, became the final line. If this defense failed, if the Legion reached Nordrassil, everything would be lost. Every warrior who could hold a weapon was called to the fight. Every mage who could cast a spell was pressed into service. This was the battle that would determine the fate of the world. It was during this desperate defense that Broxigar earned his place in legend. Thrall assigned Broxigar to lead a force of orc warriors in the defense of a vital mountain pass. This pass was a choke point that the demons would need to traverse to reach their objectives, and holding it was essential to buying time for the larger strategic plans. Broxigar understood the importance of the assignment, and he understood what it would likely cost. The warriors under his command numbered perhaps 50, seasoned fighters all, veterans of the wars who had survived the internment camps and joined Thrall's new horde. They followed Broxigar without question, trusting in his legendary reputation, believing that if anyone could hold the pass against the demons, it was Broxigar the Red. Among them was his old friend Garno, the companion of his youth who had trained beside him in the Blackrock clan's war camps. Garno had also survived the corruption and the internment, had also joined Thrall's horde, and had specifically requested to serve under Broxigar's command for this mission. The two old friends had little time for reunion, but their presence beside each other on the eve of battle was reunion enough. The pass itself was a narrow defile between two steep cliffs, a natural choke point that a determined force could hold against much larger numbers. Broxigar positioned his warriors carefully, placing them to maximize their effectiveness, setting up kill zones where the demons would be forced to advance into concentrated fire. He had learned much about defensive warfare during the Second War, lessons paid for in Alliance blood that he now turned against a different enemy. The demons came in waves that seemed to have no end. They poured through the pass like a tide of darkness, their numbers replenished faster than the orcs could cut them down. The first wave was fellhounds, fast and vicious, their maws dripping with corrupting energy. They bounded up the pass, seeking to overwhelm the defenders through sheer speed. Broxigar met them with axe strokes that carved through their corrupted flesh, sending bodies tumbling down the rocky slopes. Behind the fellhounds came fell guards, the foot soldiers of the Legion's armies. They were stronger than the hounds, more disciplined, wielding weapons of fell-forged metal that could cut through orcish armor. The battle became more desperate as these warriors engaged, each demon requiring multiple orcs to bring down, each kill costing precious energy and sometimes precious lives. Broxigar fought at the front, his axe rising and falling in rhythms of death, his body painted in demonic blood. He was everywhere at once, or so it seemed to those who watched. Where the line wavered, Broxigar was there to shore it up. Where a demon broke through, Broxigar was there to cut it down. His war cries echoed off the cliff walls, inspiring his warriors to fight harder, to hold longer, to give everything they had. Around him, his comrades fell. One by one, the warriors under his command were overwhelmed, pulled down by the sheer weight of demonic bodies, torn apart by claws and corrupting magic. Broxigar watched them die, these orcs who had trusted him to lead them, those warriors who had followed him into the teeth of hell itself. Garno fell defending Broxigar's flank. A Felguard's blade found a gap in his armor, and the old friend who had trained beside Broxigar since childhood went down with a cry of pain and defiance. Broxigar killed the demon that had struck the blow, but there was no time to help Garno, no time even to acknowledge his fall. More demons were coming, always more demons, and the battle demanded every ounce of Broxigar's attention. The hours blurred together into an endless nightmare of combat. The sun crossed the sky and began to set, and still the demons came. The pile of corpses at Broxigar's feet grew higher, forming a barrier that the demons had to climb to reach him. His arms ached with exhaustion, his wounds bled freely, his lungs burned with every breath. But still he fought. Even as his companions fell, even as the demons swarmed around him, Broxigar refused to yield. His axe never stopped moving. His war cries never ceased. His defiance never wavered. He was a single orc against an army of demons, and somehow, impossibly, he held. When the reinforcements finally arrived, they found a battlefield covered in demonic corpses. The pass was choked with the bodies of the fallen, both demon and orc, piled so high that the newcomers had difficulty making their way through. They found the pass still held, the demons unable to advance past the single point where an orc warrior stood, and they found Broxigar, covered in blood and wounds, still swinging his axe at any demon foolish enough to approach. He was the only survivor. Every other orc who had been assigned to defend that pass was dead. 50 warriors, veterans of 2 wars, had given their lives in defense of the world. They had fallen in the most glorious battle that orcs had fought in generations, and Broxigar alone had lived to see the dawn. The Horde hailed him as a hero. His defense of the pass was legendary, the kind of deed that songs would be sung about around fires for generations to come. He had held against impossible odds, had killed more demons than any single warrior had a right to slay, had achieved a victory that by all rights should have been impossible. But Broxigar did not feel like a hero. He felt like a coward. In orcish culture, there was no greater honor than to die in glorious battle, to fall alongside one's companions, weapons in hand, facing overwhelming odds. That was the death that every warrior dreamed of. The spirits of those who died such deaths joined their ancestors in a place of eternal honor, forever celebrated by those who came after. Broxigar's companions had achieved this death. They had fought until they could fight no more, had given everything they had in defense of their people, had earned their places among the honored dead. Their spirits would be welcomed by the ancestors, their names would be remembered, their sacrifices would be celebrated. But Broxigar had survived. Through some twist of fate, some quirk of circumstance, he had lived while all the others died. And in his mind, this survival was not a blessing, but a curse. He had failed his companions, had somehow not been worthy of dying alongside them, had been denied the glorious death that was the ultimate aspiration of every orc warrior. His guilt was all-consuming. He replayed the battle in his mind endlessly, searching for the moment when he should have fallen, the blow that should have killed him, the opportunity for death that he had somehow missed. He wondered if he had been cowardly, if some part of him had held back, if he had failed to commit fully to the battle in a way that had allowed him to survive when the others did not. The faces of the fallen haunted him. Garno, his childhood friend, who had fallen defending Broxigar's flank. Young Craig, barely into his adult years, who had fought with the desperate courage of someone proving himself. Grizzled old Morthar, a veteran of all three wars, who had finally found the death he had been seeking since the internment camps. All of them dead, all of them entitled to the honor that came with dying in glorious battle, all of them in the realm of the ancestors, while Broxigar remained behind. He remembered their last moments with terrible clarity, the way Garno had smiled at him before the battle began, trusting completely in their friendship and in Broxigar's leadership, the fierce joy in Craig's eyes as he charged the first wave of demons, finally having the chance to prove his worth. Morthar's steady calm as he took his position, accepting whatever fate the battle would bring. These memories cut deeper than any demon's blade. Those thoughts were irrational, of course. No one who had witnessed the battle could doubt Broxigar's courage. He had fought at the very front, had taken wounds that would have killed lesser warriors, had slain more demons than anyone could count. His survival was not due to cowardice, but to exceptional skill and the random chances of battle. Those who had seen the aftermath of the past defense marveled at what Broxigar had achieved. Shamans counted the demon corpses and lost count before they were finished. Veterans examined the positions of the fallen and reconstructed the battle, recognizing tactical genius in the way Broxigar had organized the defense. Everyone agreed that his survival was a miracle, a gift from the ancestors or the spirits or whatever forces governed such things. But Broxigar saw it differently. In his mind, survival was not a gift, but a curse. The ancestors had rejected him, had deemed him unworthy of joining them in death. Some flaw in his character, some failure in his courage, had made him unsuitable for the honor that his companions had earned. He was being punished for something, though he could not identify what. But guilt does not respond to logic. It has its own reality, its own requirements, its own terrible demands. And Broxigar's guilt demanded that he find a way to join his fallen companions, to earn the death that he had been denied, to prove that he was worthy of the honor they had achieved. This was the great paradox of Broxigar's existence during this period. He wanted to die, but not just any death would do. He needed to die in a manner so glorious, so filled with honor, that it would prove beyond any doubt that he was worthy of standing alongside his fallen companions. He needed a death that would redeem his survival, that would transform his continued existence from shame into purpose. He became consumed by a desire to die in battle. Every conflict that arose, every enemy that threatened, Broxigar threw himself at with reckless abandon. He volunteered for the most dangerous missions, sought out the most powerful foes, courted death with every swing of his axe. But death seemed to elude him. No matter how desperate the situation, no matter how overwhelming the odds, Broxigar somehow survived. His young niece Thura, though just a child at the time, could sense the darkness that had settled over her uncle. She watched him return from missions that should have been his last, saw the disappointment in his eyes when he realized he had survived again, felt the weight of his guilt, even if she could not fully understand it. This memory would stay with her for years, a glimpse of the broken warrior that her legendary uncle had become. Even Varok, Broxigar's own brother, did not fully understand the depth of his torment. The two had grown somewhat apart over the years of war and internment, and Broxigar did not speak easily of his feelings. He kept his guilt private, buried beneath a stoic exterior, visible only in the way he sought battle and the way he reacted when battle failed to claim him. The other orcs continued to honor him as a hero, continued to speak of his legendary defense of the mountain pass, continued to hold him up as an example of what an orc warrior could achieve. They did not realize that every word of praise was like a knife in Broxigar's heart, a reminder of the death he had failed to earn, the companions he had failed to join. This was the state of Broxigar's soul when the shamans of the Horde detected something strange in the Stone-Talon Mountains. A temporal anomaly, they called it, a disturbance in the fabric of time itself. It was the kind of phenomenon that demanded investigation, and Thrall needed someone reliable to determine what was happening. He chose Broxigar. The Stone-Talon Mountains rose sharply from the surrounding terrain, their peaks touching the clouds, their valleys shrouded in mist. It was rough country, difficult to traverse, filled with dangers both natural and supernatural. Broxigar did not mind. He welcomed the challenge, welcomed any opportunity that might lead him to the death he sought. Thrall sent a younger warrior named Gaskell to accompany him. Gaskell was enthusiastic and skilled, eager to prove himself worthy of riding alongside a legend like Broxigar the Red. He spoke often during their journey, filling the silence with questions and observations, trying to draw the older warrior into conversation. Broxigar mostly listened. He had little to say, and the things he thought about were not the kind of things that young warriors needed to hear. He let Gaskell talk, answered when necessary, and kept his thoughts fixed on the mission ahead. The anomaly was visible from some distance away, a shimmer in the air that seemed to bend light around itself. It pulsed with energies that made the hairs on Broxigar's arms stand up, emanating a wrongness that was impossible to describe, but equally impossible to ignore. Even without shamanistic training, he could feel that something fundamental about reality was being violated in this place. As they approached, the anomaly seemed to respond to their presence. The shimmer intensified, the pulsing became more erratic, and the air around them began to crackle with unstable energy. Gaskell suggested falling back, waiting for shamans who might be better equipped to handle whatever was happening. Broxigar did not respond. He continued forward, drawn toward the anomaly by forces he did not understand. What happened next occurred in an instant and lasted an eternity. The anomaly expanded, engulfing both orcs in a maelstrom of temporal energy. Gaskell screamed as the forces tore at his body, his essence unable to withstand the stresses of being pulled through time. Broxigar felt his companion die, felt Gaskell's life force extinguished beside him, but he could not help. He was falling, tumbling through a void that was neither space nor time, but something else entirely. He was not alone in that void. A human mage was there, struggling against the same forces that gripped Broxigar. This was Ronan, a powerful wizard who had been caught in the same anomaly. And there was a third figure, a being of immense power that Broxigar initially could not identify. This was Crassus, though his true nature as the dragon Corialstras was not immediately apparent. The three of them tumbled through the void together, bound by the energies that had seized them, carried toward a destination that none of them had chosen. Broxigar caught glimpses of things that should not have been visible, echoes of time itself flowing around him in directions that defied comprehension. He saw the past and the future intermingled, saw events that had happened and events that might yet happen, all swirling together in a chaos that threatened to shatter his mind. And then, abruptly, it stopped. Broxigar found himself lying on solid ground, the sky above him an unfamiliar shade, the air around him carrying scents that his homeland had never known. He was disoriented, confused, uncertain of where or when he was. But he was alive. Once, again, he had survived when he should have died. He did not know it yet, but he had been thrown 10,000 years into the past. He had arrived in a time when his race did not yet exist on Azeroth, when the Night Elves ruled an empire that spanned the continent, when the Burning Legion was launching its first invasion of this world. He had come to the War of the Ancients, and his presence there would change everything. The world that Broxigar found himself in was unlike anything he had ever seen. The forests were ancient beyond measure, their trees towering higher than the greatest fortresses he had known. The magic in the air was palpable, a constant presence that tingled against his skin, and the beings who inhabited this land were like nothing that existed in the time he had come from. The Night Elves, or Kaldare as they called themselves, were the dominant race of this ancient Kalimdor. Their empire stretched across the entire continent. Their civilization was built on foundations of arcane magic, and their queen Ashera was considered the most beautiful and powerful being in the world. They lived lives of luxury and enlightenment, their society having achieved heights of sophistication that few races had ever reached. Broxigar had no way of knowing any of this when he first encountered them. To him, they were simply strange beings with purple skin and glowing eyes who attacked him on sight. He fought back, of course, his instincts taking over, even in this unfamiliar situation. But he was weakened from the journey through time, disoriented from the experience, and facing enemies who outnumbered him significantly. The Moon Guard, the military force of the Kaldore, captured him with relative ease. They were a disciplined and well-trained force, skilled in both martial and magical combat, and Broxigar was in no condition to resist effectively. They bound him with magical restraints, treated him like a dangerous animal, and transported him to the city of Suramar for safekeeping. The Night Elves had never seen an orc before. Broxigar was the first of his kind to ever appear on Azeroth, and they had no frame of reference for what he was. To them, he was a monster, a beast from some unknown land who had wandered into their territory. His green skin, his tusks, his muscular build, all of these features marked him as something alien, something potentially dangerous, something that needed to be contained. They caged him like an animal, studied him from a distance, debated what to do with him. Some argued that he should be killed, that such a creature posed too great a risk to be kept alive. Others suggested that he might be useful for study, that understanding what he was could provide valuable knowledge. Still others proposed that he be used as entertainment, set against other creatures in some sort of arena. The cage itself was small, barely large enough for Broxigar to stand upright. It was made of enchanted wood, reinforced with magical bindings that prevented any escape attempt. The floor was bare stone, the ceiling was low, and there was no privacy, no comfort, no dignity. Guards rotated through on regular shifts, watching the strange creature as though he might at any moment break free and rampage through the city. Broxigar bore this treatment with the stoic endurance that had carried him through the internment camps of his own time. He had been a prisoner before, had experienced captivity and degradation before, and he knew how to survive it. He observed his captors, learned their routines, assessed their capabilities. He did not know if he would ever escape, but if the opportunity came, he would be ready. Most of the Night Elves treated him with contempt or fear. They poked at him through the bars of his cage, threw things at him, spoke of him as though he were incapable of understanding speech. Young Kaldorei would dare each other to approach the cage, to get close to the monster, to prove their courage by facing the beast. They had no idea that the beast was watching them, evaluating them, finding them wanting. It was degrading in a way that Broxigar had never experienced, worse even than the internment camps that the humans had placed his people in after the Second War. In the camps, at least, the humans had recognized that the orcs were sentient beings, dangerous perhaps, but intelligent. Here, he was treated as something less than sentient, an animal whose thoughts and feelings did not matter. But there was one night elf who was different. Her name was Tyrande Whisperwind, and she was a priestess of the moon goddess Elune. Unlike most of her people, who had grown complacent in their power and privilege, Tyrande maintained a deep connection to the older traditions of compassion and service. She served at the Temple of Elune in Suramar, tending to the sick and the suffering, offering comfort to those who needed it. She came to visit the strange creature that her people had captured, driven by curiosity and compassion in equal measure. The other night elves had described the creature as a mindless beast, a dangerous animal that needed to be contained. But when Tyrande looked at Broxigar through the bars of his cage, she saw something different. What she found when she looked at Broxigar was not a beast, but a being capable of suffering, a warrior who had been wounded in ways that went beyond the physical. She saw in his eyes a pain that she recognized, the deep and abiding sorrow of someone who has lost everything that mattered to them. She saw intelligence and awareness, the clear indication that this was a thinking, feeling being. Tyrande brought him food, real food rather than the scraps that the guards had been throwing to him. She brought bread and fruit and meat, the kind of provisions that one might give to a guest rather than a prisoner. She healed his wounds with the silvery light of Elun's blessing, her magic, closing cuts and mending bruises with a gentleness that Broxigar had rarely experienced. The healing magic was like nothing Broxigar had ever felt. It was warm and soothing, like moonlight on a summer night, like the embrace of a mother he could barely remember. It closed his wounds without pain, restored his strength without effort, touched something deep inside him that the corruption and the wars had nearly destroyed. She spoke to him in calm tones, treating him with dignity, even though he could not understand her language. Her voice was musical, carrying meanings that transcended the specific words. Broxigar could not understand what she was saying, but he could understand the kindness behind it, the genuine desire to help that animated her every action. Broxigar did not know what to make of this kindness. He watched Tyrande with suspicion at first, expecting some trick or trap. In his experience, kindness from strangers usually came with a price, usually meant that they wanted something from him. He had learned to be wary of those who offered help, had learned that trust was a weakness that could be exploited. But as the days passed, and she continued to visit him, continued to care for him, continued to treat him with respect, he began to understand that her compassion was genuine. She wanted nothing from him except the opportunity to help. She asked for no payment, expected no service, demanded no gratitude. She simply saw suffering and sought to ease it. He called her shaman, believing that the healing powers she used were granted to her by spirits similar to those that orcish shamans communed with. It was the only framework he had for understanding her abilities, and in a way he was not entirely wrong. Elun was a force of light and nature, not so different from the spirits that guided the shamans of his people. The two developed an unlikely understanding. Broxigar began to learn a few words of the Night Elves' language, while Tyrande learned to read his expressions and gestures. They communicated across the vast gulf that separated their races, finding common ground in the simple fact of shared existence. Tyrande came to realize that this creature, this orc as he called himself, was not a mindless beast. He was a warrior with honor, a being with intelligence and dignity, a person who deserved better treatment than what her people had given him. This realization would prove crucial in the days to come, when the need for allies against the Burning Legion became desperately apparent. The Burning Legion's invasion of ancient Kalimdor had begun before Broxigar arrived, but it was accelerating rapidly. Queen Ashara, seduced by promises of power from the demon lord Sargeras, had betrayed her people. She and her high-born sorcerers were working to open a portal that would allow the demons to pour into Azeroth in limitless numbers. The Well of Eternity, the vast lake of magical energy at the heart of the night. Elf Empire was the focus of their efforts. Its power was being channeled into the portal, each day bringing it closer to full activation. When it opened completely, Sargeras himself would be able to step through, and with his coming, all resistance would be crushed. Crassus and Ronan, the two other beings who had been pulled through time alongside Broxigar, had been working to find allies and stop the Legion's plans. Crassus, in particular, knew the danger that the invasion represented. In his true form, as the dragon Corialstras, he had lived through this war once before, though in a different timeline. He understood what was at stake and was determined to prevent the worst outcomes. They needed every ally they could find, and Tyrande presented them with an unexpected one. She had come to understand that the orc in her people's custody was not an enemy, but a potential friend, a warrior of exceptional skill who might be turned against the true threat. She helped Broxigar escape his imprisonment and brought him to meet the other time travelers. The meeting was tense at first. Broxigar had fought humans in his own time, had killed them by the thousands during the wars on Azeroth. To find himself allied with a human mage was strange and uncomfortable, but circumstances have a way of making enemies into allies, and the threat of the Burning Legion was larger than any of the conflicts that divided them. Ronan, to his credit, judged Broxigar not by his race, but by his character. He saw a warrior who had been broken by war, who saw death as an escape from guilt, who might find purpose in fighting against a common enemy. He treated Broxigar with respect, warrior to warrior, and in doing so, earned a measure of the orc's trust. Crassus was more difficult to read. The dragon in human form had secrets upon secrets, plans within plans, and his interactions with Broxigar were always tinged with the awareness of how much he knew that the orc did not. But he, too, recognized Broxigar's value, both as a fighter and as a symbol of the kind of courage that might inspire others to resist the Legion. Together, this unlikely group joined the growing resistance against the demonic invasion. The Kaldori resistance, as it came to be called, was gathering strength in the forests and mountains of Kalimdor. Night elves who had rejected Azshara's betrayal, who refused to bow to the demons, were forming into military units to fight back against the tide of darkness. Broxigar found a place among them. His fighting skills were immediately apparent, his ferocity in battle unmatched by any of the night elf warriors. Where they hesitated, he charged. Where they faltered, he pushed forward. Where they sought to retreat, he held the line. He was a force of nature on the battlefield, a whirlwind of axe and fury that cut through demon ranks like a scythe through wheat. The night elves had never seen anyone fight like this. Their own warriors were skilled and brave, but they fought with a certain elegance, a concern for their own survival that was simply absent in Broxigar. The orc threw himself into combat with no regard for his personal safety, taking wounds that would have felled other warriors and continuing to fight as though nothing had happened. In battle after battle, Broxigar proved his value. He held positions that other warriors could not hold, killed demons that other warriors could not kill, inspired his allies through sheer force of example. Night elves who had once looked at him with suspicion began to look at him with admiration. His methods were brutal and unfamiliar, but they were effective, and in a war for survival, effectiveness was what mattered. Jairod Shadowsong, the unlikely military commander who was organizing the resistance, recognized Broxigar's talents and used them strategically. He assigned the orc to the most difficult positions, the places where the fighting was thickest and the need for an unstoppable warrior was greatest. Broxigar accepted every assignment without question, welcoming each opportunity for combat, hoping each time that this would be the battle that finally claimed his life. But his equipment was inadequate for the task. His original axe had been confiscated by the Moon Guard when he was captured, and the replacement weapons available to him were designed for Night Elf physiology. The elven blades were too light, too delicate, lacking the heft and power that an orc warrior needed. Broxigar made do with what was available, but he knew that he was fighting below his full potential. He needed something better, something that could match his skill and his determination, something that could help him achieve the death he sought while taking as many demons with him as possible. The answer came from an unexpected source. Cenarius was one of the demigods of Azeroth, the son of the moon goddess Elune and the mighty stag Malorn. His antlers reached toward the sky like the branches of an ancient tree. His body combined the features of night elf and stag in a form that radiated natural power. He was the lord of the forest, the patron of druids, a being of immense power who had watched over the wild places of the world since time beyond memory. Cenarius had taught the night elves the ways of druidism in ages past, had helped them to understand the deeper connections between all living things. He had watched civilizations rise and fall, had seen the Kaldori Empire grow from humble beginnings to the height of its power. He rarely involved himself in the affairs of mortals, preferring to tend to the forests and wild places that were his domain. But the War of the Ancients had drawn him from his usual haunts, compelling him to join the fight against the demons who threatened everything he protected. The Legion's corruption was anathema to everything Cenarius represented. They sought to unmake the natural world, to replace the ordered beauty of life with the chaotic destruction of fell magic. He could not stand aside while such forces threatened Azeroth. The demigod had been watching Broxigar. From his vantage point among the trees, from his communion with the spirits of the forest, he had observed the orc's fighting style, his relentless determination, his utter lack of concern for his own survival. There was something in Broxigar that resonated with Cenarius, some quality of spirit that the demigod recognized and respected. Here was a warrior who would give everything in battle, who sought not victory but transcendence through combat. Cenarius had seen many warriors in his long existence, had watched mortals fight and die in countless conflicts, but he had rarely seen anyone fight the way Broxigar fought, with such complete commitment, such absolute absence of self-preservation. Cenarius approached Malfurion Stormrage, his most devoted student, with a proposal. Malfurion had been learning the ways of druidism under Cenarius's guidance, developing powers that would one day make him the greatest druid Azeroth had ever known. He was young for a night elf, but his talent was undeniable, and his dedication to the natural world was absolute. They would create a weapon worthy of the strange green warrior, an axe that would allow Broxigar to fight at his full potential. It would be crafted from the wood of ancient trees, imbued with the magic of Kalimdor itself, enchanted with power that no mortal smith could match. Such a weapon had never been created before and would never be created again. Malfurion undertook the work with characteristic dedication. Under Cenarius's guidance, he selected wood from trees that had grown since the world was young, branches that had been touched by moonlight for 10,000 years. These were not ordinary trees, but ancient beings in their own right, possessors of wisdom and power that most mortals could not perceive. He shaped this wood with druidic magic, forming it into the shape of an axe blade and haft. The wood responded to his touch, almost as though it understood what was being asked of it, as though it was cooperating in its own transformation. The process took days, each step requiring careful attention, each application of magic needing to be precisely calibrated. And then he poured into it a piece of Kalimdor's own essence, a fragment of the world's magic that would make the weapon more than mere wood. This was the most difficult part of the process, requiring Malfurion to draw upon powers that he had only recently learned to access. But with Cenarius guiding him, with the power of the ancient forest flowing through his hands, he succeeded. The result was unlike any weapon that had ever existed. It was lighter than a feather, yet stronger than the finest metal. Its edge could cut through anything, from demon hide to the thickest armor, and it would never dull or break. The wood seemed to glow with an inner light, pulsing with the heartbeat of the world itself. The grain of the wood seemed to shift and move when observed closely, as though the weapon were alive in some fundamental way. They called it the Axe of Cenarius, in honor of the demigod who had conceived of its creation. It was the only weapon of its kind, forged for a specific purpose and given to a specific warrior. No other would ever wield such a weapon, for the circumstances of its creation could never be replicated. The ceremony of presentation was simple but profound. Malfurion brought the axe to Broxigar in the presence of Cenarius himself, the demigod watching with his eternally patient eyes. There was no speech, no formal words of bestowal. Malfurion simply held out the weapon, and Broxigar took it. When Broxigar first held the weapon, he knew immediately that it was special. It felt like an extension of his own arm, balanced perfectly, responding to his will with a sensitivity that bordered on the supernatural. He swung it experimentally, felt it sing through the air, watched as it cut through a nearby stone like the stone was made of soft clay. The connection between Broxigar and the axe was immediate and complete. It was as though the weapon had been waiting for him, had been created specifically for his hands, his fighting style, his soul. He could feel the power thrumming within the enchanted wood, the piece of Kalimdor's essence that Malfurion had woven into its creation. It was not just a weapon, but a partner, a companion for the battles that lay ahead. Cenarius watched the orc test the axe and nodded in satisfaction. He had sensed something in Broxigar that few others could perceive, some quality of spirit that made him uniquely suited to bear this weapon. The demigod did not speak of what he saw, but his approval was evident in the way he inclined his head toward the warrior. For the first time since the mountain pass, something stirred in Broxigar's heart that was not guilt or despair. The axe awakened in him a sense of purpose, a recognition that perhaps his survival had not been a curse, but a preparation. He did not understand why fate had brought him to this ancient time, but he was beginning to suspect that it had something to do with this weapon and the role he might play with it. The guilt did not disappear. The desire for death did not fade. But now these feelings were joined by something else, a sense of destiny that gave meaning to his continued existence. If he was meant to die, then perhaps he was meant to die wielding this weapon in a battle of such significance that his death would matter in ways he could not yet imagine. In Broxigar's hands, the axe of Sargeras became the death of literally thousands of demons. Every battle saw him wading into the enemy ranks, the enchanted weapon rising and falling in patterns of destruction that left piles of demonic corpses in his wake. He became a legend among the resistance fighters, this strange green warrior from nowhere who killed demons with impossible efficiency. The night elves, who had initially viewed him with suspicion and contempt, began to regard him with growing respect. They had never seen anyone fight the way Broxigar fought, had never witnessed such single-minded dedication to the destruction of the enemy. Whatever he was, wherever he had come from, he was on their side, and that was what mattered. Even Tyrande, who had first shown him kindness when he was nothing but a caged beast, watched his transformation with wonder. The broken warrior she had healed was becoming something else, something more. The guilt that had consumed him was being channeled into a purpose. The death wish that had driven him was being transformed into a willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than himself. The other time travelers saw it too. Krasus recognized the signs of a hero being forged, a mortal rising to meet destiny. Ronan found himself inspired by the orc's example, pushing himself harder in battles, striving to match Broxigar's dedication. They had come to this time by accident, but perhaps they were meant to be here, meant to play roles that history had not originally assigned to them. The War of the Ancients raged across the ancient world, its battles determining the fate of Azeroth itself. The resistance forces fought desperately against the demon hordes, winning some battles, losing others, always struggling against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited numbers and resources. The scope of the conflict was beyond anything that the mortal races of this era had ever experienced. The Burning Legion was not simply an army, but a force of nature, an expression of destruction that had consumed countless worlds across the cosmos. They came through portals that never seemed to close, their numbers seemingly infinite, their power fueled by the corruption of the well of eternity itself. The resistance forces had advantages of their own. They were fighting on their home ground, knew the terrain, had the support of the land's natural spirits. The demigods who had remained neutral for millennia had finally chosen sides. Their immense power turned against the invaders, and they had warriors like Broxigar, whose courage and skill could tip the balance of individual battles. Broxigar was present at many of the war's major engagements. His role varied from battle to battle, sometimes leading charges, sometimes holding defensive positions, sometimes cutting his way through enemy ranks to reach critical objectives. He adapted to each situation with the instincts of a veteran, reading the flow of combat and responding with appropriate tactics. The battles blurred together in his memory, one engagement flowing into the next without clear boundaries. There was the defense of the forest glade, where the resistance had established a field hospital Broxigar holding the only approach, while wounded warriors were evacuated. There was the assault on a demon encampment, where he fought alongside Illidan's forces, the future lord of Outland fighting with a ferocity that matched his own. There was the desperate retreat from a failed offensive, Broxigar serving as rearguard, while the shattered remnants of the attack force escaped to safety. At Blackrock Hold, a major fortification controlled by the Resistance, Broxigar found himself fighting alongside some of the most legendary figures of the ancient world. Illidan Stormrage, whose eventual fate as the Lord of Outland was unknown in this time, fought beside him against waves of demons. Jarod Shadowsong, the young officer who would one day be remembered as one of the greatest military commanders in Kaldari history, coordinated defensive efforts nearby. The demons were pouring through portals that the Legion had opened within the fortress itself, threatening to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. Broxigar positioned himself on a bridge that served as a choke point, preventing the demons from spreading into other parts of the hold. It was a role he knew well, a reprise of his legendary stand at the mountain pass in the future. But this time, he was not alone. Illidan and Jarod worked to close the portals, while Broxigar held the line, their combined efforts preventing the full demonic force from manifesting. It was a display of coordination between warriors who barely knew each other, united by the demands of the moment. They faced the demon Malvingerath together, a powerful entity that had been leading the assault on the hold. The creature was formidable, its power enhanced by the energies flowing through the portals. But three exceptional warriors working in concert proved more than a match for it. Broxigar's axe struck the killing blow, the axe of Cenarius, cutting through the demon's defenses as though they did not exist. These battles continued for what felt like an eternity. The Resistance forces were stretched thin, covering hundreds of miles of contested territory, fighting defensive actions that bought time but did not truly reverse the tide. The portal at the Well of Eternity continued to grow, its expansion visible as a sick green light on the horizon that grew brighter with each passing day. Broxigar began to understand that something fundamental would need to change if the war was to be won. The demons had an effectively infinite supply of reinforcements, while the Resistance fighters were slowly but steadily being worn down. Unless the portal itself could be closed, unless the source of the Legion's power could be cut off, the war would eventually be lost. He spoke with Crassus about this, the dragon in human form, who seemed to know more about the situation than anyone else. Crassus confirmed Broxigar's suspicions. The portal was the key. As long as it remained open, the demons could not be truly defeated. Closing it would require getting to the Well of Eternity itself, past Queen Ashara and her highborn, past the demon commanders who defended the site, past Sargeras himself if the Dark Titan had already begun to manifest. It was, in other words, a suicide mission. The chance of anyone surviving an assault on the well was essentially zero. Broxigar smiled when he heard this. For the first time since he had been pulled through time, the path to the glorious death he sought was becoming clear. The final battle of the War of the Ancients was a convergence of forces that history had never seen assembled in one place. The Resistance fighters, the dragons who had joined the cause, the demigods who had emerged from their ancient domains, All of them descended upon the well of eternity for one final confrontation with the burning legion. This was no ordinary battle, but a conflict that would determine the fate of the entire world. If the resistance failed, if the legion's portal was allowed to fully open, Sargeras would enter Azeroth in his full power, and nothing would be able to stop him. The world would be consumed, its magic drained, its inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. Everything that had ever lived on Azeroth, everything that would ever live, depended on the outcome of this single engagement. The gathered forces of the Resistance were the greatest army that Azeroth had ever assembled. The Kaldore brought their best warriors, their most powerful mages, their most devoted priests. The dragons came in all their draconic glory, the great aspects themselves leading their flights into battle. The demigods emerged from their domains, ancient beings of immense power who had not fought in mortal conflicts for ages beyond counting. And among them was Broxigar the Red, an orc from a future that had not yet occurred, wielding an axe made from the essence of the world itself. The demons knew what was coming. They had fortified their positions around the well, concentrated their most powerful forces to defend the portal, prepared to repel any assault that the Resistance might launch. Archimond himself, one of the demon lords who served as Sargeras' chief lieutenants, commanded the defense. The Defiler had consumed worlds, had broken civilizations, had never known defeat. He was confident that this assault, like all others, would fail against the might of the Legion. Lesser demon commanders coordinated their troops with a discipline that belied their chaotic nature. Pit lords, doom guards, infernals, and countless lesser demons arranged themselves in defensive formations, ready to meet the assault. The very air around them crackled with fell energy, the corruption of the well spreading outward like a disease. The Well of Eternity was a sight that defied description. The vast lake of magical energy had been transformed by the Legion's workings, its once pure waters now churning with fell corruption. At its center, the portal loomed like a wound in reality, gateway to the twisting nether through which demonic forces continued to pour. And through that portal, growing larger with each passing moment, came the manifestation of Sargeras himself. The Dark Titan was enormous beyond comprehension. Even partially materialized, his presence distorted the world around him. Reality warped in his vicinity, the laws of nature bending to accommodate a being who had existed before those laws were established. His eyes burned with fellfire, his body radiated power that could be felt for miles, and his intention was clear, to enter Azeroth fully and claim the world for the Burning Legion. Malfurion and the other spellcasters had prepared a desperate plan. They would use the Dragon Soul, the artifact that Neltharion had created and subsequently been corrupted by, to channel enough power to close the portal. It was a dangerous strategy, one that would require precise timing and enormous amounts of magical energy. But it was their only chance. The problem was time. The ritual to close the portal would take precious minutes to complete, and during those minutes, the demons would do everything in their power to stop it. The resistance fighters would need to hold the line to prevent the demonic forces from interrupting the spell work. Every second they bought would bring them closer to victory. Broxigar found himself at the very center of the chaos. He had positioned himself near the portal itself, in the place where the fighting was most intense, where the demons were pouring through in their greatest numbers. The axe of Sargeras sang in his hands as he cut down every demon that came within reach, his body moving with a fluidity that transcended normal mortal capability. Around him, the battle raged with an intensity that defied description. Dragons clashed with demon lords in the sky above, their combat sending shockwaves across the battlefield. Night elf warriors fought and died by the hundreds, their sacrifice buying precious seconds for the ritual. The ground itself seemed to revolt against the presence of so much demonic energy, earthquakes shaking the foundations of the world. And then Broxigar made his decision. He could see that the defenders were being overwhelmed. Despite their heroic efforts, the demons were pushing through in ever greater numbers. The ritual was not yet complete, and if it failed, everything would be lost. Someone needed to do something to slow the demon advance, to buy just a little more time. Broxigar looked around at the battlefield, at the desperate struggle that was unfolding on every side. He saw night elf warriors falling to demon blades, saw dragons being pulled from the sky by swarms of corrupted creatures, saw the demigods themselves struggling against the endless tide of enemies. This was the end, he realized. Unless something changed, the resistance would be overwhelmed and Azeroth would fall. And in that moment, he understood what he had been preserved for. All his life since the mountain pass, he had sought death. He had wanted to join his fallen companions, to earn the glorious end that he believed he had been denied. He had thrown himself into danger again and again, hoping that this battle or the next would finally claim him. But death had always eluded him, had always slipped away just when it seemed certain. Now he understood why. The ancestors, the spirits, whatever forces governed the fates of warriors, they had been saving him. They had kept him alive through every battle, had preserved him through the journey through time, had brought him to this exact moment. Because here now, there was a task that only he could perform, a sacrifice that only he could make. Someone needed to go through the portal. The portal was a maelstrom of energy, a gateway between worlds that no mortal had ever willingly entered. To pass through it was to leave Azeroth behind, to enter the realm where the demons originated, to face the full might of the Burning Legion on its own ground. It was, in every meaningful sense, a journey from which there could be no return. Broxigar looked at the portal and saw his destiny. All his life, or at least all of his life since the mountain pass, he had sought a glorious death. He had courted it in every battle, had thrown himself into situations that should have killed him, had been denied again and again the ending he craved. Now, finally, he understood why. He had been preserved for this moment. All the battles he had survived, all the guilt he had carried, all the death he had been denied, it had all been leading to this. The spirits, the ancestors, whatever forces governed the fate of warriors, they had kept him alive so that he could be here, now, at the one moment when his death could truly matter. He turned to Ronan, the human mage who had become an unlikely comrade. Their time together had been brief, but intense, forged in the heat of battles that had bonded them as only combat can bond warriors. Broxigar knew that he would never see this human again, that this was the final farewell. "Farewell, wizard," Broxigar said, his voice carrying over the chaos of battle. "It is my honor to have fought beside you and the rest." And then Before anyone could stop him, before anyone could argue or try to hold him back, Broxigar leapt from the back of one of the red dragons that had been carrying warriors into battle. He dove toward the swirling maelstrom of the portal, his body silhouetted against the sickly green light, the axe of Sargeras gleaming in his hands. The portal swallowed him. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Broxigar tumbled through a void between worlds. He felt forces tearing at him, energies that would have destroyed a lesser being. But his will was iron, his determination absolute, and his purpose clear. He would not be denied, not now, not when he was so close to the death he had sought for so long. He emerged on the other side. The world that Broxigar found himself in was Argus, the homeworld of the Burning Legion. It was a world that had been corrupted beyond recognition, twisted by millennia of demonic occupation into a hellscape of fell energy and endless darkness. Once, our Argus had been beautiful, the seat of the Eridar civilization that had produced some of the greatest mages in cosmic history. Now it was nothing but a staging ground for the Legion's endless wars. The sky burned with green fire, the unnatural light of fell magic casting everything in sickly shadows. The ground pulsed with corrupt magic, the very earth poisoned by millennia of demonic presence. Mountains that had once been majestic, now twisted in tortured shapes. Rivers that had once run clear now flowed with corrupted energies. It was a world of nightmares, a place where hope had been dead for longer than most civilizations had existed, and demons stretched in every direction as far as the eye could see. They filled the landscape like a living sea of corruption, countless creatures of every size and shape, all of them servants of Sargeras, all of them instruments of destruction. The variety was staggering: imps and doomguards, fell guards and pit lords, demons that Broxigar had no names for, creatures that defied description. They had been waiting for him, or rather, they had been waiting to pass through the portal to Azeroth, and Broxigar had placed himself directly in their path. Thousands of demons, perhaps tens of thousands, all preparing to pour through the gateway and overwhelm the defenders on the other side. They were the reinforcements that would have tipped the balance of the battle, the fresh troops that would have crushed the ritual before it could be completed. And now, standing between them and the portal, was a single orc with a wooden axe. Broxigar did not hesitate. He charged. The axe of Sargeras sang as it met demon flesh, carving through the first rank of enemies, like they were made of paper. The demons fell before him, their bodies dissolving into fell energy as they died, their weapons unable to pierce his guard. He was a whirlwind of destruction, moving through the enemy ranks with a speed and ferocity that seemed impossible. More demons came, and more still. They poured toward him from every direction, drawn by the impossibility of what was happening, determined to destroy the single mortal who had dared to enter their realm. Broxigar killed them all. His axe never stopped moving, his war cries never ceased, his body never slowed. The corpses began to pile up around him, demon bodies, dissolving but not quickly enough, accumulated beneath his feet in a mound that grew higher with each passing moment. Broxigar stood atop this mountain of the dead, still fighting, still killing, his armor stained with demonic blood, his face twisted in a rictus of savage joy. He had found it. After all this time, after all this searching, he had finally found the death he had been seeking. Not just any death, but a death of unimaginable glory, a death that would be remembered for eternity, a death that would make everything he had survived worthwhile. And what a death it was becoming. Broxigar stood at the center of a storm of violence, the axe of Cenarius cutting down every demon that came within reach. His arms moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible, each stroke finding its mark, each swing adding another corpse to the growing pile beneath his feet. The demons fell before him like grain before a scythe. The enchanted axe sang as it worked, its wooden blade cutting through demon hide as easily as through air. It never dulled, so never wavered, never faltered. The piece of Kalimdor's essence that Malfurion had woven into its creation responded to the need of the moment, channeling power that no mortal weapon could match. In Broxigar's hands, it was the most deadly weapon that had ever been turned against the Legion. But he was not satisfied with merely dying. He wanted to take as many demons with him as possible, wanted to buy as much time for his companions as he could, wanted his sacrifice to mean something beyond his own release from guilt. So he fought on, beyond the limits of endurance, beyond the capabilities of mortal flesh, driven by a will that refused to yield. Each demon he killed was a demon that would not pass through the portal to threaten the spellcasters. Each moment he held was a moment closer to the ritual's completion. His sacrifice was not passive, but active, a continuous act of defiance that drew more and more of the Legion's attention toward himself and away from the vulnerable ritual sites. The demons began to hesitate. They had faced countless opponents over the millennia of the Legion's existence, had destroyed civilizations and conquered worlds, had broken the mightiest champions of 100 races. But they had never seen anything like this. This single orc, this mortal warrior with his wooden axe, was killing them faster than they could approach him. Broxigar mocked them. He shouted challenges in his native tongue, dared more demons to come face him, laughed at their attempts to bring him down. He was not fighting for victory, was not hoping to escape. He was simply demonstrating, to himself and to anyone who might remember, what an orc warrior was capable of when he held nothing back. The mountain of corpses grew higher, and then something changed in the air. A presence was approaching, something vastly more powerful than the demons Broxigar had been fighting. The fell energy around him intensified, reality itself seemed to bend, and the remaining demons fell back in reverence and fear. Sargeras was coming. The Dark Titan was beyond mortal comprehension. His form was larger than mountains, his power greater than worlds. He had existed since before time had meaning, had shaped the cosmos according to his will, had destroyed more civilizations than any mortal could count. He was the Lord of the Burning Legion, the fallen champion of the Titans, the ultimate embodiment of destruction. Sargeras had once been the greatest of the Titans, the champion who defended creation against the forces of chaos and corruption. He had fought the Void Lords and their servants, had protected the ordered universe from those who would unmake it. But the endless battle had broken something inside him, had led him to conclude that the only way to prevent the void from consuming everything was to destroy everything first. He had turned against his brothers and sisters, had formed the Burning Legion to carry out his mission of universal destruction. He had corrupted the Eridar of Argus, turning them into the demons who now filled the Legion's ranks. He had killed one of his fellow Titans, Agrimar, and would have killed more if he could. He was madness given form, destruction given purpose, the end of all things made manifest. And now his attention was fixed on a single orc. Sargeras had been in the process of manifesting through the portal when Broxigar's assault began. The orc's actions had slowed the flow of demons through the gateway, had disrupted the careful timing of the invasion. More than that, Broxigar's defiance had attracted Sargeras's notice, had drawn the Dark Titan's gaze away from his larger plans. The very concept should have been laughable. What was one mortal, however brave, compared to a being who had unmade stars? What threat could a single warrior with an axe pose to an entity that had battled the Titans themselves? Sargeras should have been able to ignore Broxigar entirely, should have focused on the more important work of completing his entry into Azeroth. But something about the orc would not let him. Perhaps it was the axe of Cenarius, the weapon forged from Azeroth's own essence, that drew Sargeras's attention. Perhaps it was the sheer improbability of what Broxigar was accomplishing, the impossibility of a mortal single-handedly holding off the entire Burning Legion. Perhaps it was something in Broxigar's spirit, some quality that resonated even with a being as vast and terrible as the Dark Titan. Whatever the reason, Sargeras came for him personally. The approach of the Dark Titan was like the approach of a natural disaster. The ground trembled, the air burned, reality itself seemed to groan under the weight of his presence. The demons that Broxigar had been fighting scattered before their master, unwilling to be caught between the orc and Sargeras's wrath. Broxigar looked up at the approaching god and felt no fear. This was what he had wanted, what he had sought, what he had been preserved for. The ultimate death, the ultimate battle, the ultimate proof of an orc warrior's courage. Even if no one ever knew what happened here, even if his sacrifice went unremembered, this moment was worth everything. He raised the axe of Cenarius and charged. The distance between them closed in an instant. Broxigar leaped, his body straining against its mortal limitations, the axe raised above his head for a killing stroke. He knew he could not truly hurt the Dark Titan, knew that even the mightiest weapon forged by mortals was nothing against such a being. But the axe of Cenarius was not an ordinary weapon. The enchanted wood, imbued with a piece of Kalimdor's magic, connected with Sargeras's leg. And impossibly, incredibly, unbelievably, it drew blood. A small wound, barely a scratch by the standards of such a being, but a wound nonetheless. The axe of Cenarius had done what nothing else in mortal history had ever accomplished. Broxigar the Red had wounded Sargeras. The wound was small. In the grand scope of Sargeras's existence, it was less than nothing, a momentary inconvenience that would be forgotten before it was fully healed. But in that moment, for that instant, it was enough. For Broxigar, the moment of striking Sargeras was the culmination of everything he had ever been. All his training, all his battles, all his suffering, all his guilt, everything that had made him the warrior he was, came together in that single stroke. The axe of Cenarius, forged from the essence of Azeroth itself, connected with the flesh of the being who sought to destroy that world. It was an act of defiance so complete, so absolute, that it transcended the normal boundaries of what mortals could achieve. And it drew blood. Back on Azeroth, Krasus and the other spellcasters had been working to close the portal. They had been struggling, their efforts so hampered by Sargeras' will, his power keeping the gateway open through sheer force of presence. They needed something to break his concentration, something to distract him even for a second. The wound provided that distraction. Sargeras felt it. Across the infinite distance, between Argus and the closing portal, the Dark Titan felt the bite of the axe of Cenarius. It was not painful, not truly, but it was unexpected. It was impossible. And for one crucial moment, his attention wavered. That moment was all that was needed. Krasus and his allies focused their spell work on the wound, using it as a point of concentration, a focus for their power. The portal, which had been resisting their efforts, suddenly began to collapse. Sargeras, realizing what was happening, tried to force his way through, tried to complete his manifestation before the gateway closed. Malfurion and Illidan, working together despite their differences, poured everything they had into the spell. The portal collapsed inward, the energies that had sustained it dissipating, the connection between worlds being severed. Sargeras was caught halfway through. The closing portal cut through the Dark Titan like a blade, severing the portion of him that had manifested on Azeroth from the greater whole that remained on the other side. The release of energy was catastrophic, sending shockwaves across the entire world. The well of eternity, unable to contain the forces being released, began to collapse in on itself. This was the Great Sundering, the cataclysm that would reshape Azeroth forever. The continent of Kalimdor shattered, breaking apart into the separate landmasses that would define the world's geography for the next 10,000 years. The eastern portion became what would be known as the Eastern Kingdoms, home to humans and dwarves and many other races. The western portion retained the name Kalimdor, becoming the new home of the Night Elves who survived the catastrophe. The seas rushed in to fill the void where the Well of Eternity had been, creating the great swirling maelstrom that would mark the center of the world's oceans. This perpetual storm was a wound in reality, a reminder of the forces that had been unleashed when the portal collapsed. Sargeras would remain for millennia, a testament to the price that had been paid to save the world. Millions died as the world tore itself apart. The Night Elf civilization, which had reached heights of sophistication and power that few races had ever achieved, was effectively destroyed. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were swallowed by the waves or shattered by the earthquakes. The knowledge and culture of generations was lost, preserved only in the memories of the survivors and the scattered records that managed to survive. It was the birth of the world, as it would be known in later ages, the end of the ancient Night Elf Empire, the beginning of a new chapter in Azeroth's history. The survivors would rebuild, would create new civilizations on the ruins of the old, would eventually forget much of what had been lost. But the Great Sundering would never be forgotten, would remain in the collective memory of every race that had been touched by it. And at the center of all of this destruction, at the moment when the world was literally being torn apart, Broxigar's sacrifice had made the difference. His wound on Sargeras had provided the distraction that allowed the portal to close, had prevented the Dark Titan from completing his entry into Azeroth. Without that wound, without that moment of Sargeras's wavered attention, the ritual might have failed. The portal might have remained open, Sargeras might have fully manifested, and no power in the world would have been able to stop him. But before all of that, on the other side of the closing portal, Sargeras had one final action to take. He looked down at the orc who had wounded him, this insignificant mortal who had achieved the impossible. Broxigar stood before the Dark Titan, his axe still raised, his defiance unbroken even in the face of certain death. He had done what he set out to do. He had earned his glorious ending. For a timeless moment, orc and titan regarded each other. Sargeras saw, before him, a creature that by all rights should not have been able to inconvenience him in the slightest. Yet that creature had done what no other mortal had ever done. There was something in Sargeras's gaze that might have been recognition, an acknowledgement of the impossible courage that Broxigar had demonstrated. And Broxigar looked up at the being who had ended civilizations, who had corrupted worlds, who had brought ruin to everything he touched, and he felt no fear. This was the death he had sought, the glorious end that would redeem his survival at the mountain pass. He would fall to the greatest enemy that had ever existed, and in falling, he would prove himself worthy of standing alongside his fallen companions. Sargeras's broken sword, Gorabal, descended. The blow was fatal. Broxigar's body was impaled on the jagged edge of the weapon, lifted from the ground, his life force draining away. But even in death, even in the final moments of his existence, Broxigar did not yield. He looked up at the god who had killed him, met Sargeras's burning gaze, and smiled. It was not a smile of defeat, but of triumph. He had bought the time that was needed. He had wounded a god. He had achieved a death more glorious than any orc warrior had ever known. His companions at the mountain pass would be proud. His ancestors would welcome him with honor. He had won. Crisis, watching from across the closing portal, saw Broxigar's body hanging from Sargeras's sword. He saw the orc's spirit depart, saw the empty shell that remained, and in that moment he understood the true magnitude of what Broxigar had accomplished. The portal closed, severing the connection between worlds. Broxigar's body was lost on the other side, abandoned on Argus among the mountain of demons he had slain. His sacrifice had saved Azeroth, had given the spellcasters the moment they needed to close the portal, had prevented Sargeras from fully manifesting in the world. Broxigar the Red was dead, but his legend was only beginning. The Great Sundering reshaped everything. The ancient supercontinent of Kalimdor was torn apart, its fragments becoming the continents and islands that would define Azeroth's geography for the next 10,000 years. The Well of Eternity was destroyed, its power dissipating into the world, leaving behind only the swirling maelstrom that marked its former location. The scale of the destruction was difficult to comprehend. Cities that had stood for millennia vanished beneath the waves in moments. Mountains that had seemed eternal crumbled into the sea. Rivers reversed their courses, forests were swept away, and entire populations simply ceased to exist. The world that emerged from the Sundering was almost unrecognizable, a shattered remnant of what had been before. The survivors of the catastrophe found themselves scattered across the new landscape. Night elves, who had been far from the well when it collapsed, made their way to higher ground, gathering at the slopes of Mount Hyjal. They were the lucky ones, the few who had been positioned just right to survive when the world tore itself apart. They would become the core of the new Night Elf civilization, rebuilding from the ruins of the old. Dragons who had survived the battle retreated to their sanctuaries to nurse their wounds. The great aspects had paid a heavy price for their participation in the war, their flights diminished by the losses they had suffered. It would be centuries before they recovered their strength, before they were ready to take an active role in the world's affairs once more. The demigods returned to their domains. Their participation in mortal affairs ended for the time being. Cenarius withdrew to his forests, grieving for his father Malorn, who had fallen in battle against Archimonde. He would not be seen among mortals for thousands of years, watching from afar as the world slowly healed from the wounds of the Sundering. Amid all this chaos, Ronan found something unexpected. Washed up on the shore of the new Kalimdor, deposited there by forces that defied explanation, was the axe of Cenarius. The weapon that Broxigar had carried through the portal, that he had used to wound Sargeras himself, had somehow survived the closing of the gateway and the sundering that followed. It lay on the sand, still glowing with its inner light, waiting for someone to claim it. The axe should not have been there. By every law of magic and physics, it should have been lost on Argus along with Broxigar's body, should have been consumed by the chaotic energies of the closing portal. But there it was, as though the weapon itself had refused to be lost, had fought its way back through the void to the world it was created to protect. Ronan understood immediately the significance of what he had found. This was not just a weapon, but a symbol, a testament to the sacrifice that had saved the world. The piece of Kalimdor's essence that Malfurion had woven into its creation still pulsed with life, still connected the axe to the land that had birthed it. It needed to be preserved, needed to be returned to those who would understand its importance, needed to be kept safe until the time came for it to be used again. The axe had been created for Broxigar, but its purpose extended beyond any single warrior. There would be future battles, future threats, future moments when such a weapon might make the difference between victory and defeat. Together with Crassus, Ronan convinced the bronze dragon Nozdormu to allow them to bring the axe back to their own time. Nozdormu was the aspect of time, the great dragon charged with protecting the integrity of the timeways. He rarely permitted objects or beings to be moved between eras, understanding the dangers that such temporal manipulation could cause. It was an unusual request, one that touched on the delicate balance that Nozdormu had sworn to protect. But the aspect understood the importance of what they were asking. The axe of Cenarius was more than a relic. It was a symbol of hope, proof that mortal courage could accomplish the impossible. Its presence in the present era would inspire warriors for generations to come. The axe of Cenarius would return to the era from which Broxigar had come, completing a circle that spanned 10,000 years. When they arrived back in their present, Crassus's first act was to bring the axe to Thrall. The war chief of the Horde was the appropriate recipient, the leader who would understand what the weapon represented and who could ensure that it was properly honored. Crassus could have kept the axe for himself, could have added it to his vast collection of artifacts and treasures. But this weapon did not belong to dragons. It belonged to the orcs. Crassus appeared before Thrall, disguised as an elderly orc shaman, a figure of wisdom and reverence. The disguise was perfect, as Crassus's shape-shifting abilities had been honed over millennia of practice. He carried the axe of Cenarius with him, the wooden weapon that had accomplished what no other weapon in history had ever done. And he told Thrall the story. He spoke of Broxigar the Red, of his survival at the mountain pass, and the guilt that had consumed him. He spoke of the temporal anomaly that had pulled Broxigar into the past, of the War of the Ancients, and the role that the orc had played in it. He spoke of the final battle at the Well of Eternity, of Broxigar's leap through the portal, of his impossible stand against the entire Burning Legion. And he spoke of the wound. The orc warrior Broxigar, alone among all mortals who have ever lived, wounded the Dark Titan Sargeras, Crassus told the war chief. He gave his life to buy us the moment we needed to close the portal. Without his sacrifice, Azeroth would have fallen. The world you know exists because Broxigar the Red chose to die so that others might live. Thrall listened in silence, his face unreadable. When Crassus had finished, the war chief reached out and took the axe, feeling its weight, sensing the power that thrummed within the enchanted wood. This was a weapon of legend, a relic of a hero whose deeds surpassed anything that Thrall had ever imagined. I will see that his story is told, Thrall said. I will see that his sacrifice is remembered. Broxigar the Red will be honored among our people for as long as orcs walk upon this world. And so it was done. The Night Elves raised a statue to Broxigar. It was an unprecedented honor, one that no orc had ever received, and that no orc would likely receive again. The statue stood as a testament to the warrior who had fought alongside them against the Burning Legion, who had earned their respect through courage and sacrifice, who had given his life to save a world that was not even his own. The statue depicted Broxigar as he had been in those final moments, his axe raised, his face set in an expression of fierce determination. It captured something of his spirit, the indomitable will that had allowed him to stand against the darkness when lesser warriors would have fled. Night elves who passed by the statue would pause to remember the strange green warrior who had come from nowhere and changed the course of history. Tyrande Whisperwind, who had first shown kindness to Broxigar when he was nothing but a caged beast, never forgot him. Even millennia later, even after all the history that had unfolded between her people and the orcs, the mere mention of his name was enough to bring tears to her eyes. She remembered the broken warrior she had healed, the noble spirit she had recognized beneath his savage exterior, the sacrifice he had made at the end. There was a special place in Tyranda's heart for Broxigar, a memory that time could not dim. She had seen something in him that others had missed, a nobility of spirit that transcended the brutish appearance of his race. She had treated him with kindness when kindness was scarce, and he had repaid that kindness by helping to save her world. It was a debt that could never be repaid, a memory that she treasured throughout the long millennia that followed. Malfurion's storm rage honored Broxigar as well. The druid who had crafted the axe of Cenarius under his mentor's guidance remembered the orc who had wielded it. He spoke of Broxigar to those who would listen, ensuring that the story survived even among a people who had little love for orcs. For Malfurion, the memory of Broxigar was inseparable from the memory of the axe he had created. He had poured something of himself into that weapon, had imbued it with power drawn from the very essence of Kalimdor. and Broxigar had used that power to achieve something impossible, to wound a god, to save the world. The axe had been worthy of its wielder, and the wielder had been worthy of the axe. But perhaps the most remarkable memorial to Broxigar existed in a place that no one from Azeroth knew about for 10,000 years. On Argus, the homeworld of the Burning Legion, there lived a broken people called the Krokul. They were Eridar who had refused to follow Sargeras, who had remained on their corrupted world and endured millennia of demonic oppression. They had little hope and fewer joys, their existence a long struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. But they remembered Broxigar. The Krokul had witnessed his arrival through the portal, had watched in astonishment as a single mortal warrior held off the entire Burning Legion. They had seen him wound Sargeras himself, had observed the Dark Titan's reaction to the impossible blow. They did not know his name, did not know the world he had come from, but they recognized a hero when they saw one. They called him the Great Warrior, and they built a shrine to honor him. The shrine of the Great Warrior was a modest structure, hidden in the caves and hovels where the Krokul made their homes. It contained relics that the Broken Ones had managed to recover from the site of Broxigar's final stand: his necklace, one of his boots, a shoulder pad from his armor. These simple items were treated as sacred objects, proof that even the mightiest of demons could be wounded by mortal courage. The Krokul had seen what no one else had witnessed, the aftermath of Broxigar's final battle. They had crept to the site after the demons had departed, found the mountain of corpses that he had created, and marveled at what a single warrior had accomplished. They had searched through the carnage and recovered what they could, treasuring these relics as proof that resistance was possible. For 10,000 years, the Krokul maintained this shrine. Generation after generation passed down the story of the great warrior, keeping his memory alive in a place where hope was scarce and heroes were all but unknown. They did not know that his people called him Broxigar the Red, did not know that he was an orc from a world called Draenor, but they knew that he had given them something precious, the knowledge that Sargeras was not invincible. The shrine became a pilgrimage site for those Krokul who still held onto hope. They would come in secret, avoiding the demon patrols that roamed the corrupted landscape, and spend time in the presence of the relics. They would whisper prayers to the great warrior, asking for his strength, his courage, his willingness to stand against impossible odds. In times of particular desperation, when the demons seemed closer than usual, when the weight of oppression seemed too heavy to bear, the Krokul would tell the story of the great warrior. They would describe how he had come through the portal, how he had fought against the endless tide of demons, how he had climbed the mountain of corpses he himself had created. They would speak of the moment when he had struck Sargeras, when he had done what no one had ever done before, and in those stories they found the strength to continue. When the heroes of Azeroth finally came to Argus, when the war against the Legion entered its final phase, they discovered the shrine of the great warrior. The discovery came during the campaign to liberate Argus from the Legion's control, when Alliance and Horde forces fought side by side against the demons in their own homeland. The adventurers who found the shrine were stunned by what they discovered. The relics were unmistakably orcish in origin, the armor distinctly of a style that had not been seen for generations. And the Krokul who tended the shrine told them the story, the tale of the warrior who had held against the legion, who had wounded Sargeras himself. They recognized the relics, understood what they meant, and realized that Broxigar's sacrifice had been witnessed and honored by those he had never known. Orcs who were present wept at the discovery, recognizing in these simple objects a connection to one of their greatest heroes. The shrine was treated with reverence, its significance understood by all who encountered it. It was, perhaps, the greatest memorial that any warrior could receive. Not a monument built by those who knew him, but a shrine maintained by strangers who had witnessed his sacrifice and been inspired by it. For 10,000 years, across the vast gulf of space and time, Broxigar's courage had given hope to those who had none. In the years that followed the War of the Ancients, Broxigar's legend grew among the orcs of Azeroth. Thrall made good on his promise to Crassus, ensuring that the story of Broxigar the Red was told and retold around campfires and in great halls. Orcs who had never heard of the mountain pass defense, who had never known that Broxigar had been pulled through time, learned of his ultimate sacrifice. The story became part of the orcish cultural identity, a tale told to young orcs to teach them about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of honor. Broxigar became a model for what an orc warrior should aspire to be, not simply a fighter of great skill, but a being of indomitable will who would never yield, never surrender, never give less than everything he had. The shamans incorporated Broxigar into their teachings. They spoke of how he had been preserved by the ancestors, kept alive through battle after battle until he reached the moment when his death could save the world. They used his story to illustrate the idea that every orc's life has purpose, that survival itself can be a form of destiny, that the spirits have plans that mortals cannot always understand. Young orcs grew up hearing about Broxigar's charge through the portal, about his stand against the endless demons, about the moment when he struck Sargeras and drew the blood of a god. These stories fired their imaginations and shaped their understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. They dreamed of achieving their own glorious deaths, of proving themselves worthy of standing alongside Broxigar in the realm of the ancestors. The axe of Cenarius was kept safe, preserved as the sacred relic that it was. Thrall himself guarded it, waiting for the day when it would be needed again. He consulted with his shamans about the weapon's destiny, seeking guidance from the spirits about what should be done with it. The axe was more than simply a weapon. It was a symbol, a connection to the ancient past, a reminder that mortals could achieve the impossible when they were willing to give everything. Thrall treated it with appropriate reverence, keeping it in a place of honor within his stronghold, bringing it out for ceremonies and important occasions. The answer came in a dream. One of Thrall's most trusted shamans received a vision showing the axe being wielded by a young orc warrior, a female whose connection to Broxigar went beyond mere admiration. The spirits were clear. The axe of Cenarius should go to Thura, Broxigar's niece. Thura had grown up hearing stories of her legendary uncle. She remembered him from her childhood, remembered the guilt that had haunted him, remembered how she had sensed his pain even when she was too young to understand it. Learning of his true fate, of what he had accomplished in the past, transformed her understanding of who he had been and what he had sacrificed. The broken warrior she had known as a child, The orc who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders had been something far greater than she had imagined. He had not simply disappeared on a scouting mission in the Stone Talon Mountains. He had been pulled through time itself, had fought in the greatest war in history, had achieved a death more glorious than any orc before or since. Thura spent long hours learning everything she could about her uncle's final days. She spoke with the shamans who had received Krasus's account, pressed them for every detail they could remember. She sought out anyone who had known Broxigar before his disappearance, gathering fragments of his story, trying to understand the orc who had become a legend. The picture that emerged was complex and tragic. Broxigar had been a hero long before his journey through time, a warrior whose skills were matched only by his sense of honor. But the guilt he carried from the mountain pass had broken something inside him, had driven him to seek death in every battle. That he had finally found the death he sought, and that this death had saved the world, was a conclusion so fitting that it seemed almost ordained. When Thrall presented her with the axe of Cenarius, Thura felt the weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders. The ceremony was held before a gathering of the Horde's greatest warriors, a recognition of the significance of what was being passed on. Thrall spoke of Broxigar's sacrifice, of the importance of the axe, of the responsibility that came with wielding such a weapon. This weapon, which had wounded a god, which had saved a world, was now hers to wield. Thura felt the same connection that Broxigar had felt when he first touched the axe, the sense that the weapon was more than mere wood and magic. It was alive in some fundamental way, responsive to her will, eager to continue the work it had been created for. She vowed to honor her uncle's memory, to prove herself worthy of the legacy he had left behind. The axe would not sit idle in some shrine. It would be wielded in battle, used against the enemies of the Horde, carried forward by a warrior who understood what it represented. But destiny had its own plans for Thura and the axe. In the novel Stormridge, Thura received disturbing visions that seemed to reveal the truth about her uncle's death. These visions came unbidden, invading her dreams and even her waking thoughts. They showed Malfurion Stormrage killing Broxigar, suggested that the night elf had betrayed the orc warrior, implied that the story Thrall had been told was a lie. The visions were vivid and terrible. Thura saw her uncle standing before Malfurion, saw the druid's hands weaving magic, saw Broxigar falling beneath some mysterious attack. She heard what sounded like Malfurion's voice, taking credit for the killing, boasting of how he had destroyed the orc who had dared to fight alongside his people. Each vision added new details to the supposed betrayal. Thura learned, or thought she learned, that Malfurion had been jealous of Broxigar's prowess, had resented the attention that the orc received from Tyrande and others. The night elf had waited until the battle was over, and then struck, murdering the hero who had helped save his world. Consumed by rage and grief, Thura swore vengeance. The uncle she had loved, the warrior she had admired, had been betrayed by those he had fought to protect. The knowledge burned in her heart like a fire that could not be extinguished. She would find Malfurion Stormrage, would face him with the axe of Cenarius, would avenge her uncle's murder. She pursued Malfurion into the Emerald Dream, determined to avenge her uncle's death with the very axe he had wielded. The journey was dangerous. the Emerald Dream being a realm of nature and spirits that few mortals had ever entered. But Thura was driven by a purpose that overrode all concerns for her own safety. She did not know that the visions had been false, did not understand that she was being manipulated by forces beyond her comprehension. The truth was far more complex than she could have imagined, and her quest for vengeance was actually serving a purpose that she had never intended. The truth was stranger than she could have imagined. Malfurion himself had sent the false visions, not out of malice but out of desperation. He was trapped within the Emerald Nightmare, transformed into a tree by the dark power of Xavius, the Nightmare Lord. The corruption that had once threatened to consume the Emerald Dream had finally taken one of its greatest defenders. The only thing that could free him was the axe of Cenarius, and the only way to bring the axe to him was to trick Thura into seeking vengeance. It was a cruel deception, one that Malfurion took no pleasure in, but he saw no other option. If he remained trapped, if the nightmare succeeded in claiming him completely, the consequences for Azeroth would be devastating. Malfurion did not enjoy the deception. He carried guilt for manipulating Thura, for using her grief and rage as tools to achieve his freedom. But he saw no other option. The axe of Cenarius was unique, its power drawn from the essence of Azeroth itself. Only it could cut through the nightmare magic that held him prisoner. When Thura finally reached Malfurion and struck him with the axe, she was not committing murder, but liberation. The enchanted weapon cut through the tree form that imprisoned him, severed the bonds of nightmare magic, and freed the archdruid to fight against the forces of corruption. The vengeance she had sought became the salvation that Azeroth needed. The moment of the strike was transformative. Thura felt the axe respond to the task, felt the piece of Kalimdor's essence within the weapon recognize its purpose. The wood that had wounded Sargeras now struck against the corruption of the nightmare, cutting through magical bonds as easily as it had cut through demon flesh. Malfurion emerged from the tree form, gasping, weakened but free. He looked at the orc who had liberated him, at the axe that had saved him, and felt a complex mixture of gratitude and guilt. He had used Thura's love for her uncle, had manipulated her grief for his own purposes. It was necessary, but that did not make it right. Understanding came later, when the truth of what had happened was revealed. Malfurion himself explained the deception, apologizing for the pain he had caused, expressing his deep respect for both Thura and the uncle whose memory she carried. He spoke of Broxigar with reverence, describing the orc as he had known him during the War of the Ancients. Thura learned that Malfurion had not killed her uncle, that Broxigar had died as a hero exactly as the stories said. The druid told her details that no one else could have known, moments of Broxigar's service that had not made it into Crassus's account. He spoke of her uncle's courage, his dedication, his ultimate sacrifice. The rage that had driven her faded, replaced by a complex mixture of emotions. Gratitude that she had been able to help, shame that she had been deceived, pride that her uncle's weapon had once again saved the world. The axe of Cenarius had been used as Broxigar would have wanted, to fight against the enemies of life, to cut through corruption and darkness. She kept the axe of Cenarius. It was hers by right of inheritance, hers by the will of the spirits, hers by the destiny that had been woven around her since before she was born. She would carry it forward, would wield it in battles yet to come, would continue the legacy that Broxigar had begun. The axe had saved the world twice now, once in the hands of Broxigar and once in the hands of his niece. It seemed fitting that the weapon should remain in the family, passed down through the generations, always ready to be wielded against whatever darkness threatened Azeroth. The story of Broxigar does not end with his death or with Thura's inheritance of his axe. His spirit, like the spirits of all orcs who die with honor, joined the ancestors in whatever realm exists beyond mortal life. There, he was finally reunited with the companions who had fallen at the mountain pass, the warriors whose deaths had haunted him for so long. The reunion was everything that Broxigar had dreamed of during his years of guilt. Garna was there, his childhood friend, whole and at peace. The 50 assigned warriors who had followed him into that desperate defense were there, their spirits uncorrupted by the horrors they had witnessed. Even orcs from earlier in his life, companions from the wars and the internment camps, gathered to welcome him. They had known, in the way that spirits know things, what Broxigar had accomplished after their deaths. They had watched as he struggled with his guilt, had observed his journey through time, had witnessed his final sacrifice, and they were proud beyond words, not because he had wounded Sargeras, though that was remarkable enough, but because he had never stopped trying to be worthy of them. In that realm, there was no more guilt. The shame that had consumed Broxigar in life was washed away by the glory of his final sacrifice. His companions welcomed him as a brother, honored him as a hero, celebrated the deeds that had made his name legendary across 2 eras of history. The death he had sought for so long proved to be not an ending, but a beginning, the start of an eternity among those he had loved. Broxigar found peace in the realm of the ancestors. The restless drive that had pushed him through battle after battle was finally satisfied. The need to prove himself, to earn his place, to demonstrate that he was worthy of standing alongside the honored dead, that need was fulfilled beyond any possible doubt. He could rest at last. But even in that rest, he remained who he had always been, a warrior of the orcish people, a defender of those who needed defending, a spirit of courage and defiance. The realm of the ancestors was not a passive place, not simply a reward for deeds done in life. It was a place where the honored dead could watch over the living, could offer guidance and inspiration to those who would come after. But even the dead can sometimes touch the living. During Azeroth's first kosh'harg festival, since the orcs had abandoned their old traditions, held in Razor Hill as part of the effort to reconnect with their heritage, something remarkable happened. This festival represented a return to the ways of old, an attempt to reclaim the culture that the corruption had stolen from the orcish people. Shamans led ceremonies, warriors competed in tests of skill, and all present honored the memory of those who had come before. Orc adventurers, performing rituals to honor the ancestors, found their offerings accepted in ways they had not expected. The connection between the living and the dead, which had been severed by the corruption and weakened by years of exile, was being restored. The spirits of the ancestors responded to the sincere devotion of their descendants. Spirits appeared. The ghosts of legendary orcs manifested before the living, called forth by the power of the ceremony and the sincerity of the devotion. The air shimmered with ancestral energy, and forms began to take shape that had not been seen by living eyes for years or centuries. Among them was Broxigar the Red, standing alongside his brother Varok Saurfang and other heroes of orcish history. Varok himself had died relatively recently, falling at the gates of Orgrimmar in a duel that had changed the fate of the Horde. The brothers stood side by side once more, united in death as they had been in life. The sight of these legendary figures sent waves of emotion through the gathered orcs. Here were heroes whose stories they had been told since childhood, whose deeds had shaped the very identity of the orcish people, and chief among them was Broxigar, the warrior who had wounded a god, the only mortal ever to draw the blood of Sargeras. Broxigar spoke to those who had summoned him. His voice was like thunder rolling across distant mountains, carrying the weight of ages and the wisdom of the honored dead. He commended them for their courage, for their willingness to risk their lives for just causes. He spoke of what it meant to be an orc, to carry the legacy of their ancestors, to live with honor in a world that often made honor difficult. He told them that he looked forward to meeting them again in the afterlife, that he would welcome them when their time came. It was a blessing from a legend, a moment of connection between the living and the dead that would be remembered by all who witnessed it. The orcs who heard his words felt the weight of them, understood that they were being called to live lives worthy of such a welcome. And then he was gone, returned to whatever realm the spirits of the honored dead inhabit. The shimmer in the air faded, the sense of ancestral presence diminished, and the living were left alone with their memories of what they had witnessed. But his words remained with those who had heard them, a reminder that the ancestors were watching, that the deeds of the living mattered to those who had come before. The kosh'harg had succeeded in its purpose, reconnecting the orcish people with their heritage, reminding them of who they were and who they could become. Thura was present at that kosh'harg, bearing the axe of Cenarius on her back. The weight of the legendary weapon was familiar now, a constant presence in her life since Thrall had bestowed it upon her. She moved through the gathered orcs with the quiet confidence of a warrior who knew her purpose. She did not speak to her uncle's spirit, did not have the chance for a private reunion. The manifestation was brief, the time too short for individual conversations. But she saw him, knew that he was at peace, understood that his long journey had finally brought him to the rest he had earned. Their eyes met across the distance that separated the living from the dead. In that moment, something passed between them, an acknowledgement that needed no words. Broxigar saw the axe on her back, knew that his legacy was in good hands. Thura saw the peace in his eyes, knew that her uncle had finally found what he had sought for so long. It was enough. Broxigar the Red holds a unique place in the history of Azeroth and in the legends of the orcish people. He was a warrior who fought in 4 wars, if one counts his participation in the War of the Ancients alongside the conflicts of his own time. The First War, the Second War, the Third War, and the War of the Ancients. Each conflict tested him, each battle added to his legend, each victory and defeat shaped the warrior he would become. He was an orc who earned the respect of night elves, who was honored with a statue by a race that had every reason to despise his kind. The night elves had watched their world nearly destroyed by the Burning Legion, had lost millions of their people to the catastrophe that followed, had seen their ancient empire shattered beyond recovery. And yet, They honored an orc, a member of a race that would one day fight against them, because they recognized the courage and sacrifice that transcended racial boundaries. He was the only mortal, alongside a king of the Eldrachi whose name has been largely forgotten, to ever wound Sargeras the Dark Titan. The Eldrachi were a race of beings whom the Legion had attempted to recruit, offering them power in exchange for servitude. They had refused, and their king had led them in a hopeless defense against the demons. In that defense, the Eldrachi king had somehow managed to strike Sargeras, though the details of how this happened have been lost to history. Broxigar's wound, by contrast, is documented in detail, witnessed by those who could pass the story on. This last distinction is perhaps the most remarkable. Sargeras was a being of cosmic power, a fallen titan whose corruption had driven him to seek the destruction of all life in the universe. He was not simply a powerful demon, but something beyond demons, a being who had existed since the universe was young, who had shaped the very fabric of reality, who had wielded powers that mortals could not comprehend. He had destroyed worlds beyond counting, had commanded armies that numbered in the billions, had broken the mightiest champions of 100 civilizations. The civilizations that had fallen before him were not weak or primitive. They had developed technologies and magics that rivaled or exceeded anything found on Azeroth. They had heroes and champions of their own, beings of great power who had risen to defend their worlds, and Sargeras had crushed them all. And yet a single orc, wielding an axe made of enchanted wood, had managed to draw his blood. The impossibility of this achievement cannot be overstated. It was as though an insect had wounded a star, as though a single grain of sand had scratched a mountain. By every measure of power and capability, Broxigar should not have been able to touch Sargeras, should not have been able to even approach close enough to try. The wound itself was insignificant in terms of Sargeras' physical well-being. A titan heals faster than mortals can comprehend, and the cut from the axe of Cenarius would have closed before the battle was over. But the symbolic significance was immense. It proved that Sargeras was not truly invincible, that even the darkest of gods could be touched by mortal courage. The wound became a symbol, a sign that even the most hopeless resistance could achieve something meaningful. When warriors faced impossible odds, when civilization stood against the Legion, knowing they could not win, they could draw strength from the knowledge that Sargeras himself had bled. If one orc could wound a god, then perhaps any act of defiance could matter. For the Krokul of Argus, this knowledge was a source of hope during 10,000 years of oppression. They had watched the great warriors strike their tormentor, had seen the blood flow, had witnessed the moment of impossibility. This memory sustained them through millennia of suffering, gave them the strength to continue when continuation seemed pointless. For the warriors of Azeroth, it was an inspiration to stand against overwhelming odds. When the Legion returned during the events that would become known as the Third Invasion, when the armies of demons seemed unstoppable, the story of Broxigar was told and retold. If one orc could wound Sargeras, then surely the combined might of Azeroth could defeat his armies. For orcs everywhere, it was proof that their people could achieve deeds that would be remembered for eternity. The corruption and the wars had stained orcish history with atrocity and shame. But Broxigar represented something else, a hero whose deeds were entirely admirable, whose sacrifice was entirely selfless, whose legacy was entirely pure. He was a model of what an orc could be, a reminder that their people were capable of more than the destruction that had defined their arrival on Azeroth. Broxigar's guilt, the shame that had driven him to seek death, transformed into something greater than he could have imagined. The survival that he saw as a curse became the preservation that allowed him to accomplish his ultimate destiny. If he had died at the mountain pass, as he wanted to, the War of the Ancients would have unfolded differently. The portal might have remained open, Sargeras might have fully manifested, Azeroth might have fallen. The guilt that had seemed so overwhelming, the shame that had consumed his every waking moment, these had been the forces that drove him forward. Without the guilt, he might not have sought death so relentlessly. Without seeking death, he might not have volunteered for the most dangerous missions. Without volunteering, he might not have been sent to investigate the temporal anomaly. Without the anomaly, he would never have been pulled through time. Every step of his painful journey had led him to the moment when his sacrifice could save the world. Instead, Broxigar lived long enough to find his way to the past, to earn his place in the greatest battle in history, to strike some blow that distracted a god. His life was not wasted, but invested, not squandered, but spent at exactly the moment when it could make the greatest difference. The timing of his journey through time was not coincidence. The forces that governed such things, whether spirits or fate or something beyond mortal understanding, had arranged for Broxigar to be exactly where he needed to be. The temporal anomaly that pulled him to the past occurred at precisely the moment when his presence would be most needed. He arrived in time to participate in the War of the Ancients, to receive the axe of Cenarius, to be at the final battle when his sacrifice could save everything. This is the lesson of Broxigar the Red. Sometimes what seems like failure is actually preparation. Sometimes the death we seek is not the death we need. Sometimes the spirits know better than we do when our time has truly come. The path to glory is not always straight, and the destination we seek is not always the destination we need. Broxigar's journey teaches us that suffering can have purpose, that pain can be transformed into power, that the darkest chapters of our lives can be the prelude to our greatest achievements. He carried his guilt like a wound that would not heal, and that wound drove him forward until he found the moment when his death could matter more than his life ever could. The shamans of the Horde teach this lesson to young orcs, using Broxigar's story as an example of how the ancestors work in mysterious ways. They speak of how the spirits preserved Broxigar through battle after battle, keeping him alive for a purpose that he could not understand. They explain how his guilt, which seemed like a curse, was actually the force that drove him to seek the death that would save the world. An orc who feels lost, who feels that his life has no purpose, can look to Broxigar and see that purpose can be found in the most unexpected ways. The warrior who felt cursed by survival was actually blessed, preserved for a purpose greater than he could imagine. Every moment of his suffering, every battle that should have killed him but didn't, every day that he carried the weight of his guilt, all of it was preparation for the sacrifice that awaited him. Broxigar sought a glorious death, and in the end, he received one beyond his wildest imaginings. No orc warrior before or since has achieved what he achieved. No mortal champion of any race has struck a blow against an enemy as powerful as Sargeras. He stands alone in the history of Azeroth, a unique figure whose deed will never be surpassed. He sought to join his fallen companions, and in the end, he joined them covered in glory that exceeded anything they had achieved. He sought an ending, and in the end, he became a legend whose story would be told for as long as stories are told. His name is spoken with reverence by orcs and night elves alike, by all who know what he sacrificed and what he accomplished. The story of Broxigar continues to resonate with those who hear it because it touches on universal themes. The struggle with guilt, the search for redemption, the desire to prove oneself worthy. These are experiences that transcend race and culture. Anyone who has ever felt that they failed those who depended on them, anyone who has ever sought to make up for past mistakes, can see something of themselves in Broxigar's journey. His story also speaks to the nature of heroism. Broxigar did not become a hero because he was born special, because he was chosen by prophecy, because he had some innate advantage that others lacked. He was simply an orc warrior, one among many, distinguished only by his courage and his willingness to give everything he had. He became a hero through choice, through will, through the decision to stand and fight when running would have been easier. Anyone can make that choice. Anyone can decide to face the darkness rather than flee from it. And in that decision lies the potential for greatness. The axe of Sargeras continues to exist, held by Thrall as she carries her uncle's legacy forward. The weapon that wounded a god awaits the day when it will be needed again, when some new threat will require its unique capabilities. And when that day comes, when the axe is raised once more against the enemies of Azeroth, the spirit of Broxigar will be present, lending his strength to whoever wields his blade. For Broxigar is not truly gone. Heroes never truly die, not so long as their deeds are remembered, not so long as their stories are told. He lives on in the stories that are told about him, in the lessons that shamans teach, in the inspiration that warriors draw from his example. He lives on in the axe of Sargeras, the weapon that carries a piece of his essence within its enchanted wood. He lives on in the statues and shrines that honor his memory, in the respect that even night elves show when they speak his name. And he lives on in the realm of the ancestors, where he awaits those who will one day join him. Warriors who die with honor will find him there, ready to welcome them, ready to share the eternal rest that the honored dead enjoy. He will be there when Thrall's time comes, ready to greet his niece who carried his legacy so well. He will be there when any orc who lived with courage joins the ancestors, a legend among legends, a hero for all time. Welcome to the afterlife, Broxigar the Red. Your companions are waiting, your ancestors are proud, and your place among the eternal honored ones is secure. You earned it. You earned every single moment of it through sacrifice and courage. The fires burn low in the great halls of the ancestors. The songs of glory echo through eternity. And Broxigar the Red, the warrior who wounded a god, the orc who saved the world, sits among his companions and knows peace at last. His story is complete. His journey is ended. His rest is eternal. But for those of us who remain in the world of the living, his story continues to inspire. When we face our own impossible odds, when we struggle with our own guilt and shame, when we wonder if our lives have purpose, we can remember Broxigar. We can remember that even the most hopeless situation can be transformed by courage, that even the deepest guilt can be redeemed by sacrifice, that even the most broken spirit can rise to heights of glory. That is the complete story of Broxigar the Red. If you enjoyed it, please like the video and subscribe. We have a lot more deep Warcraft lore waiting for you here on World of Sleepcraft.